clamshells basically in the soil, and pretty impressive diversity down there as well. And then rare pine savanna habitats of the coastal plain, exceptional habitats as well. Again, wetlands like Lawrence Creek, which is a spring-fed or groundwater-fed seepage swamp. So it's a cypress tupelo swamp like you might get in East Arkansas in the Delta, but it's in the coastal plain, and there's sandy and gravelly uplands surrounding the swamp, and the groundwater flows through those uplands and feeds this swamp with this cool sort of acidic groundwater, and you get way higher species diversity in these habitats than you would in, say, a Mississippi River oxbow swamp that might have the same trees in it, but 1/5 the number of species on the plant species that are on the ground. And these groundwater areas are very important for a number of rare habitats. This is a mountain seep, or what we call a wooded, in this case it's a wooded seep, where it's, you know, in the forest and rugged terrain in the mountains. I'll talk more about those as we go. And its sort of cousin in the coastal plain that we call a bayhead seep, so named for the species of small tree there on the left side in the foreground. It's a Sweetbay Magnolia, which is a characteristic species of this community. And these are these groundwater seeps are really important for a number of orchid species, especially in sedges and ferns as well. We have 44 native orchids in Arkansas, and many of them are found only in these seepage wetlands, like these yellow fringed orchids, crested fringed orchids, and Kentucky lady slipper orchids. I like to show this slide just to illustrate this really important point about plants, well, not just plants, about all biodiversity, but plants in particular. The biodiversity is not uniformly distributed in the landscape, and it's not random. It's very much concentrated in sort of special habitats. Can people see my cursor? I guess you probably can.
Yes.
In sort of your typical upland slope, say in the Ouachita Mountains, this site is on the North Fork of the Saline River. It's near Perrin, Arkansas, Saline County. Just an example. And this grid that you see, it's sort of a red dashed grid, and then I have a blue line over top. That's a mile by a mile square right there. So within this area, say if I was sent out from Natural Heritage, we were interested in maybe acquiring a tract to add to a natural area, I would go and be sent out to say, well, what's on the ground? You know, what's the condition? What's the diversity? Go make a inventory of all the species that are there. We would not, you know, go out randomly in like a grid or something and walk out there. We would go in first in a computer and sort of try to classify the different types of habitats that might be there. So you might have on this south slope here a certain kind of natural community, sort of a dry pine oak woodland, and you might expect a certain level of diversity on the ground of plant species. You know, somewhat diverse depending on how open it is or if it's had fire on it, that kind of thing. But then you might have this really rocky, barren ridge line, and that might be totally different habitat. And then you might have there's some bluffs along the river here. You've got a north-facing bluff here and sort of a west-facing bluff up here. You have some wetlands that are not the actual river channel, but sort of these backwater areas that might be totally different habitat, and in fact it is than the river channel itself. And you might have areas where these wooded seeps occur in these, where these hollows meet up in the high parts of the mountains along headwater creeks, where the groundwater might seep out based on the kind of geology we have there. So those places will have disproportionate biodiversity in those special sites, much more so than sort of the matrix community, what we call it, just the run-of-the-mill dry woods that we have out in those places. So we want to make sure to hit all those kinds of spots and not just kind of go out randomly, because you're going to find different species there. And then this is the same thing on I always show a lot of these color infrared aerial photos. So these are really useful to the ecologists. They show, especially if they're taken in the winter, the way the film works, or the technology works, is anything that's growing, vegetation that's growing, it's actively growing when the photo is taken, shows in various bright shades of red or pink. So if you see something here, like where my cursor is here, that's a bunch of pine trees, right? And then if you see up on this ridge line, it's all sort of this whitish, bright gray. That's a hardwood woodland, so it's the white is actually grass, and maybe you're seeing through. And then the same token, these fields that are gray in the winter are warm season grasses, or grasses that are green during the warm season of the year. Where if it was a fescue pasture, it's a kind of a grass that's green in the cool season, you would see that whole field would be pink. So you can see a lot and learn a lot about the things. The wetlands are also dark, so to show up this sort of dark, almost blackish color, dark gray. That's an old channel scar wetland, really useful to the person interested in studying the flora. So what makes a plant grow in a certain area? That's another big thing to understand if you're interested in understanding plants in the landscape. And these are just kind of a short list of the major things that would affect what plants are growing on a site. The location geographically, where it is in the world, what's the latitude and longitude, what ecoregion are you in, et cetera. Every plant species has a range, a broad area in which it occurs naturally. Some things get moved around. A lot of our invasive plants came from other continents or brought over accidentally or on purpose. That range is altered by humans when that happens. A lot of our native flora is really sort of still in the range that it used to be in. But plants move over time, and they have for millions of years. So we find things in one place that maybe it's in our dry, rocky glades, but its main range, and it's rare here in those habitats, its main range is in the desert Southwest. And we have these disjunct or far separated occurrences in these specialized habitats. And that's a big story about our biodiversity, our history. I'll talk more about that as we go on through. But back to a given site, you've got slope. So how steep is the site, is the terrain. You have certain things that grow on really steep slopes that don't grow on kind of more poorly drained flat sites, and vice versa. The aspect, which is the direction that a site faces. So it's useful to illustrate that point with a slope. You can talk about a south-facing slope that gets direct sun all the time. It's very dry and hot compared to a steep north-facing slope that really is always shaded. And the sun's always in the southern half of the sky at our latitude. And similarly, east-facing slopes are generally cooler and more moist than west-facing slopes. They get the cool morning sun. In the afternoon, the sun gets over to the west and beating down on those west-facing slopes. So aspect is a big deal. Hydrology, the kind of water or the duration of the water in the system, how long it sits there. Also its source, what kind of water is it? Is it mineral-rich groundwater? Is it rainwater? Is it water that flooded from a river that has a large watershed that gathered that water from tens of thousands of square miles? Or is it a little depression on a mountaintop that has a 10-acre watershed that flows down into it? All sorts of different factors there with the hydrology. Also, I mentioned how long the water is resident on the site. The geomorphology is the shape of the landform itself. I'll talk a little about that when we get to the coastal plain in a little while. The soils, what are the soils like? What are their physical properties? What are their nutrient levels? What are their what's the kinds of minerals they have in them? Is the pH high or low? All those sorts of factors. Is it coarse sediment like sand or gravel, or is it really fine silt or clay? The geology, what is the parent material? Is there rock at the surface? Of course, rock is a soil ingredient in the soil, so the underlying bedrock geology affects the soils. The thinness of the soil also is a factor. The climate and the weather, where you are, how much rainfall do you get? Is it changing over time? We're seeing that big time now. We get a lot more rain in the last few years than we're generally accustomed to, and certainly that the plants are accustomed to in some habitats. So it's pretty interesting seeing some shifts in things. The canopy density and composition, is it a wooded area with shade from the trees? And then another factor is that composition of the canopy. So is it deciduous canopy where there's light let through in the early part of the growing season from the last frost of the year when the plants on the ground begin to really grow to the time that the trees leaf out and become shade inducing on the ground? Does it have that period, or is it an evergreen forest? Is it a pine forest that's 100% closed canopy with pine that shades the ground all year, where it's an evergreen canopy? Or is it some combination of both? How open is the canopy? How much light hits the ground? And what kind of, even that influences the soil. Pine needles will make an acidic soil over time compared to some of the other kinds of trees we have. The disturbance regime. Are there natural disturbance processes that these communities depend on that are still at work? Things like prescribed fire or periodic flooding along major river floodplains, or grazing and browsing by large herbivores that we don't have that functioning the same as we did at one time. They're not bison and elk, for example, exerting influence on a large part of the landscape anymore. And are there non-natural or anthropogenic human-induced disturbances at work that are really shifting the intense cattle grazing with confined grazing, or fire suppression, or periodic mowing of a site? Those things would influence the vegetation. And then the past land use, that's a big deal, especially looking at these natural areas. So we want to find a site that sort of still is intact as much as possible, or like it was historically. And that has a lot to do with past land use. You might have two prairies that you're looking at, one of which has been a hay field for 150 years, where they just cut hay off of it every year, and have never plowed the soil, or it's never been heavily grazed. You might have another prairie that is managed that same way for the last 50 years, but for 50 years prior to that was fenced in, and they had livestock, heavy cattle grazing in there. Even though that was 50 years ago that happened, that may completely have altered the plant community over time. And those two sites today are not they're not the same. One has twice the number of species and a lot of rare plants still on it, and the other one's lost that due to whatever happened in the past. So those are just some things. Here's an illustration I like to show. It shows aspect, the effect of aspect. This is a ridge west of Little Rock. This is this is North Fork Pinnacle, which is the road that sort of loops around the side on the lower left of the photo. There's a road called the Winona Scenic Drive. Lake Winona, one of the water supply lakes for Little Rock, is off to the left in the valley off of this photo. But in the Ouachitas, you have this phenomenon where you have these east-west trending ridges. So I'm looking west along the top of this ridge. You can see these ridges all sort of run to the horizon, east-west orientation. And if you look on the south-facing slope, the right side of each or the left side of each ridge, you see a whole lot of pine trees. And what you're seeing there is shortleaf pine, the native pine in the Ouachitas. And then if you look on the north-facing slope, it's a lot less pine. And that's a factor of it's hotter and drier on the south-facing slope than the north-facing slope. You also see on the north-facing, see if I have it. Nope, I don't have illustration. On the west-facing or the south-facing slope, you'll have a lot of the drier oaks, post oak, blackjack oak on the upper ridges. As you get on the other side, those kind of drop out a lot of times. You'll pick up white oak. And on the lower north-facing slope, you'll start to pick up northern red oak and sometimes basswood and beech trees and things like that, depending on where you are. But very different even at the tree canopy level. And also on the south slope, you have a lot more of this rocky, thin soil barrens community, sort of like you're seeing right in this area. So pretty different. And that's, again, the trees are totally different. And imagine, as you go down to the shrubs and to the herbaceous plants on the ground, it's really quite different. So that's a great illustration of how different, or how the aspect or the direction of the slope faces influences vegetation. Just another shot of the same thing. Geomorphology is really important, especially in riverine systems. This is, again, the land shape, the land form, and understanding the sometimes very subtle differences in, say, height or elevation, soil type, and flood duration along these river systems get you totally different. So or explains the differences in the vegetation. So you look at a high gradient stream at the top. This would be like an upper reach of a mountain stream or something. You have the channel itself that's shown sort of with water, and then you have sort of the FP, which is a floodplain. So that's regularly floods in an event. And then you might have one terrace, or that T1 is terrace 1. So it's up elevated. It's an abandoned older floodplain. So that used to be the floodplain. Of course, all these streams cut down over time naturally and abandon these higher terraces. And the bigger your stream is, the more of these terraces you have, and the older they are. So how long a site has existed is important in the vegetation, how it has accumulated plants over time. Terrace 3 on that lower illustration might be, for example, a 100,000-year-old river terrace on the Arkansas River, where that second terrace might be 50,000 years old, the first terrace might be 20,000, and the floodplain may be a couple hundred years old. So when you have that, the statistical probability of vegetation becoming established and staying on a surface that's 100 times older than the lowest floodplain, it makes a big difference over time, and the diversity of the flora. It's pretty fascinating stuff. This really kind of are the puzzles that have been worked out over time by ecologists that explain a lot of the diversity. And of course, soils. This is a great resource right here. This is in Google Earth. There's a soil map, wall-to-wall coverage for free of all of the United States. And you can click on any one of these polygons, and there's a code there of the soil type, but that'll take you to a link that has information on the soil itself, the mineral content, how well drained it is, what the percent clay is, the pH, all these great things. And this is really a major factor in the distribution of plant assemblages or communities across the world. And there's still, in natural heritage, we do basic field-based science, old school, go out, document what's there. We rely a lot on volunteers. We have some master naturalists that collect plants. They have presses and dryers and all that, and they go out and collect specimens for us. It's a very valuable resource. We have the herbarium at our office that is the repository for all these scientific specimens that get collected. But this is the same kind of basic field science that's been going on for hundreds of years around the world, and still a great need for it. Just go out and collect, document, get data on these sites, on the plants that grow on them. If that's something any of you are interested in, we would very much like to have a training at some point to go over the basics of what to collect and what kind of information to get, what's valuable to collect and what's not worth the effort, and all those sorts of things. And we can provide presses to people that are really interested in this. But those specimens then get pressed and dried. They get a label mounted on them with all the information on where it was collected and when and by whom and what the habitat was. And in the case of rare things, we like even more information, like associated species that it grew with and all that sort of thing. And these become part of the permanent record. And of course, a lot of master naturalists are now helping us image the collection. We've got about 20,000 specimens in the collection right now at our office, and these are all going online, so anyone can go and look at them and the information they contain. And also, people are helping digitize the information, and some of you are involved. These are a great resource, especially these old specimens. So they're specimens from Arkansas dating back to 1819, so 200 years plus old now. These are like it's like having a time machine. You get to go back. This is just one illustration. This is a shrub called, it's a native spirea called hardhack or steeplebush. Very rare today in Arkansas. We track it as a rare species of concern, the Heritage Program. This is a record from the Grand Prairie in East Arkansas from July 1884, and collected by this guy, Francis Harvey, who was a botany teacher at the University of Arkansas in the very early time of the university, 1870s and 80s. And if he had not collected this shrub from Grand Prairie, we would have never known it was part of that ecosystem. So there's none of this to our knowledge, left in that part of the world. We had no idea it even existed there. The nearest sites are in southern Pulaski County in some similar grassland savanna habitats. And until we found this specimen, we had no idea. But now, because he collected that and it's still around, we know if we're going to do say a wet prairie restoration in the Grand Prairie, well, here's another species that maybe we should make sure we reintroduce to the site there. So we would thank Mr. Harvey for collecting that. And we compile and keep all this information on rare species especially. This is the screenshot out of the Natural Heritage Database with rare species records from around the state. And this is probably plants and animals combined, but each one of these dots, and we representing them here as dots, but in actuality in the database, we can map them in more specifics about, say, if it's a rare plant that lines the fringe of a pond, we can map it as a ring around the pond, or if it's something that's on a cliff face that extends for 100 feet, we can map it as a sort of linear feature on that cliff face. But each one of these dots represents the occurrence of a rare species or a high quality natural community, or a rare natural community in some cases. So for example, this particular record here is this rare grass. And this grass was described new to science in 2006. It was prior to that mistaken for another species that grows east of the Mississippi River. But in fact, it's a distinct species, and it's only found in pine savanna habitat in the coastal plain. It's called Crowell Silky scale, and this is the actual occurrence record in the heritage database. It has information, the same information that is actually on that specimen label. It says where it was collected. It was in a power line right of way, which was an area that was historically pine savanna. There were 50 plus plants observed, scattered in low areas, infrequently mown right away. It's got a comment of there's actual herbarium specimen at Natural Heritage, what the number of the specimen is, when it was seen, who collected it, all that stuff's there. And that lets us know that that occurs in that particular site. And you'll actually notice there's a whole line of these rare plants in this power line right away that runs down the right side of the screen there. And that's no accident. All of those species are plants that need open, frequently burned pine savanna, which is a habitat that's almost gone. And really they only exist today in sort of these surrogate habitats like rights of way that are open, maybe mown once every couple of years, but kept open. And they used to be all through the woods 150, 200 years ago in these areas, but today they're only found, those are all pine plantations along there now. They get clear cut and sprayed with herbicide, and then they spend 25 years as a very dense plantation with very little sunlight hitting the ground. And those species have declined except in those special habitats. There's some neat stories to tell. We use these data on plant and animal and natural community occurrence to do conservation planning, to do environmental review of, say, projects like highways or pipelines or development. There are no real laws in Arkansas protecting plants, but we do provide information on the occurrences of these things to regulatory agencies, which we are not, and also to developers or timber companies or highway department or whoever's doing development projects. We also have the main uses of this data is for conservation planning. So we've identified hotspots of biodiversity in Arkansas. This is just one map of probably a set of 30 maps in this project that show different types of biodiversity, but it lets us know where we can get the biggest bang for the buck when we're conserving land, or where we need to focus more, or what's already been protected, that sort of thing. And we don't do the conservation planning just in Arkansas, but say for the interior highlands, the Ouachitas, Arkansas Valley, and Ozarks, we do the conservation planning in conjunction with scientists and conservationists in Missouri and Oklahoma. So we wouldn't want to, say, spend all our money in Arkansas protecting dolomite glades of the Ozarks when Missouri has 5 times more of that habitat than we do, and they already have big chunks of it protected in the Mark Twain National Forest. Whereas, not that we don't want to protect any here, but we want to maybe prioritize some habitats that would be in the Boston Mountains, which we have all of the upper Boston Mountains right here in the middle of the screen. And there's unique ecosystems and habitats in that ecoregion that are not shared by Missouri and Oklahoma. So we would want to make sure that we had the lead on that, and we were protecting those sites if they weren't well protected already. And all the work we do is leveraged through cooperative partnerships with all sorts of other agencies and nonprofits and municipalities, and just there's a lot of cooperation in Arkansas that's unfortunately kind of unique in the conservation realm. A lot of other states, I work in a lot of other states as well, and people are blown away with how well we work together here among the different entities. A little background on Arkansas's botanical biodiversity. This is out of date, so we have probably over 3,000 species documented now outside of cultivation. But these are vascular plants. It doesn't include the mosses or the liverworts or the really primitive things like that. It's everything from the ferns on up. So it's the higher plants, so to speak. And again, these are ones that are outside of cultivation. So this includes both the native things and the naturalized non-native things, but things that are on their own without, don't need human intervention to sustain themselves in the landscape. And of those, about 21.5% is considered not native here, and leaving about 78.5% that are native. Over 500 are tracked as rare, sensitive, or threatened by the Natural Heritage Commission. And then there's a whole nother series of several hundred that are kind of on an informal watch list of things that, you know, they may well be of concern now, but which we don't have a lot of information about, or which are likely to become of concern in the future. So a big chunk of the native, and that's all, of course, just the native stuff. So a big chunk of the native flora is at risk or in decline. And that leads us into sort of a discussion on what makes something rare. Well, there's different kinds of rarity or vulnerability, and we assess that at two levels. So one of the things that our scientists at Heritage have done is gone through all the species of plants and animals in the state and all the different types of habitats and natural communities, and ranked them, given them what we call a conservation status rank. And we do that at the state level because that's where our information is gathered. But it's also done with a collaborative process with other natural heritage programs in other states throughout the ranges of all these things, is done at the global scale or the range-wide scale. So every species gets what we call a G rank and an S rank. And these ranks run from a scale of 1 to 5. And 1 is what we call critically imperiled. Maybe just a couple of sites in the world would be a G1. And then on the other extreme is a G5, which is throughout its range globally, very secure. Something like a loblolly pine tree or something, very secure, lots of them around, not really in any threat. They're doing great. And then the same thing at the state level. So we might have something that's very rare here in a rocky desert-like glade. It's known from, like, for example, there's a fern called Wright's Cliffbrake that we did not know was in Arkansas until 2013. We found it in a really nice rocky glade mountainside in Hot Spring County. And the nearest site was in Central Texas, I think. And the main range is in the desert Southwest. It's in Utah, New Mexico, Arizona. It's a desert outcrop, full sun, rocky barrens, cliff face, kind of a fern. And it was known from the western part of the U.S. and 2 sites in North Carolina in rare rock outcrop communities. Nowhere else in between. We found it there, and it became an S1. We added it's very rare in Arkansas, but it's a G5 because it's common out in Utah and northern Mexico and places like that. So we have these things that are rare here, but very common in another part of their range. It'd be like a G5 S1. We might have something here that's an endemic. And when we say endemic, talking about biodiversity, we use it a little differently than the medical use of the term. When we say something's endemic, it means it's restricted to a certain area. So we would say it's endemic to the Ouachita Mountains. Maybe it only occurs in a few counties in Arkansas and Oklahoma and the Ouachitas. It'd be endemic to the Ouachitas. One plant I'm going to talk about later is endemic to Saline County. 2 sites in the world, basically, in Glades and Saline County. And that would be the rarest of the rare. We get a G1 S1. It's rare both globally, extremely rare, and also extremely rare in the state level. So we can have all these different combinations of these ranks, but you can never have an S rank that's a higher number or more common than the G rank. So you'll never see a G1 S3, but you will definitely see a G3 S1. That makes sense. And so things that are locally rare, but maybe not rare elsewhere, are things that are on the edge of their range or disjunct here. Misspelled on the slide, apologize. And then, so what makes it rare? That explains kind of how we assess rarity. But what makes it rare? Well, there's 5 major factors, and there's others that you could talk about too. But the big ones are habitat destruction, which likely is still the #1 threat to most things. Just totally getting whacked. Their habitat is maybe, unfortunately, say there's a rare glade type, and this happens a lot of places where there's a rare rock type, rare chemistry to the rock, and it's super biodiverse. There's maybe endemic species that are found only on that specific rock type, nowhere else in the world. But that rock type is very valuable in a monetary sense, right? So there's extreme pressure on those glade habitats to be mined out for industrial use. So we see that here. There's the nepheline syenite, which is where we would have gone hiking today, down on Granite Mountain. It's a granite-like rock. Most of the glades and barrens historically that were on that habitat have all been destroyed. And there's really just a few examples left in the world that haven't been mined out. And those are, of course, of highest conservation importance that we have. And that's just an example of something that's been heavy loss from habitat destruction. Some plants have difficulty reproducing, and that's generally poorly understood, but it's easy to see. Sometimes it has to do with genetic factors. There's low genetic diversity today in that species, and it has trouble reproducing. Sometimes maybe a pollinator's become extirpated that it needs, or for whatever reason. Maybe climate has changed to a different way that's altered its reproduction or its ability to reproduce. Other things are just picky about where they grow. There's a really neat rare plant in the nepheline syenite glade. It's called small-headed pipewort. And small-headed pipewort has to have all these factors line up just perfectly for it to survive. It has to be in an open grassland glade of barrens, open sun. Has to be in a very thin soil over bedrock that's saturated by water from, or at least pretty moist from the time it germinates in the winter all the way until, say, June when it flowers. So if you have a dry spring, you'll have 0 plants. If you have a good wet spring and you have a good site where it is occurring and it has seeds there, you'll have maybe thousands of plants. It just depends on everything has to line up just right. And it has to have that specific microsite with all those factors. So it's just picky about where it grows. Other things are endemic. They're just restricted to a narrow range. And then a big one are changes in ecosystem processes. So that's kind of a nebulous concept. We'll talk more about it in a minute, but things like fire or big-scale flooding that a species needs in order to survive. You talk about rarity, everyone talks about, is it threatened, endangered, or endangered? Is it on the federal endangered species list? Well, there are only 5 plants known from Arkansas that are listed as official federally listed species. And they're not even our rarest plants. So there's a lot of plants that are rarer than these that are not on the list. And there's a lot of political pressure on not listing things. I mean, this is a fraught topic we could get into a lot of details on, but as of now, there are only 5 species known from Arkansas. One of them, running buffalo clover, has not been seen in the state since the 1800s. We look for it all the time, and I suspect it's probably here, but we haven't been able to find any. The other 4 we know about. This is a quick rundown. These are Geocarpon minimum, which is a tiny little plant that occurs in a very rare habitat of saline soil, naturally salty barrens, in a few sites in the coastal plain in the Arkansas Valley. And the picture there, that blue thing, is a ballpoint pen. So you can see how small this plant is. It's like an inch tall. Very rare species. This is the habitat it grows in. Kind of likes this is a barren salt slick. It's a natural saline outcrop of subsoil in sort of a short grass barrens with savanna with post oak trees. But right around, there's no plants that grow out in the middle of this stuff. It's too extreme for plants. But right around the margins, in this very fringe of short vegetation, is where that geocarpon lives. Another one, and the only shrub on the endangered list in Arkansas, is pondberry. Clownberry is related to the common spice bush, if you know that one, but it's a very rare wetland cousin. It grows in natural depression wetlands, or little ponds and other bottomland sort of depression wetlands. Across several states in the southeast, but it's extremely rare as well. Missouri bladderpod's a little mustard that lives in glades. This is a funny one because it was only known for Missouri until the 1990s, and it was the only plant that was endemic to Missouri and known nowhere else. So we're very proud of it. And on a Native Plant Society field trip to Ozark County, a person from Missouri who knew the plant really well found it in a glade in Arkansas. So it was like the first record from them. We took away their only endemic, and they were kind of bummed out. And we started finding it at other sites across the Ozarks. We found it at about 5 sites up there. And then a few years later, we found it in the Ouachitas and got pretty excited about that. And we joked with them that we're publishing a paper, we're going to rename it the Razorback Bladderpod. And they didn't think it was very funny. But we since have been studying carefully the populations, and they've done genetic work on it out of the Missouri Botanical Garden, and the plants in the Ouachitas are distinctly different, especially genetically, and potentially some morphological or observable features, and probably warrant splitting out as a distinct separate species, which would be new to science. It's only known from 3 places in the Ouachitas and shale grades. Another endangered species, or threatened in this case, is the running buffalo clover. This is the one that's missing in action. We have an old record from 1880s from Independence County, and one from the 1890s in Pulaski County. I might have those mixed up, but anyway, 1800s for both. This occurred historically along bison trails and other areas that had some sort of disturbance by trampling of animals, and also floodplains of rivers where there was a flood disturbance. Both of those particular factors are largely gone from the landscape. We've tamed the rivers, we've extirpated the bison, and we pretty much at this point have seen a really dramatic decline in the species. It was actually thought to be extinct until the 1980s, when it was found in, I want to say, Ohio or West Virginia. And then there's a few populations that have been found since then, but very rare. And it's not the common white clover that we have. I used to, every time I give a talk, I'd have someone come up after, I've got that in my yard. But in fact, the main difference is you see a pair of leaves that come off the stem, the aerial stem. There's also a creeping stem that runs across the ground. You can see here. But it comes up and has a pair of leaves opposite each other. The flowers are quite a bit larger, actually, also than the common white clover. But here it is in Missouri at a natural site they found. I went up to see it, and it occurs along a hiking trail. So it has that sort of trampling effect that you would want to see. And then the other one that we have is Harperella. It's a species of rocky, high-velocity floodplains and mountain rivers, these really violently flooding mountain rivers where it occurs in the stream channel under specific hydrologic conditions. Let's see what time it is. I'm 48. We'll go till 10. We'll take a break. And I can answer some questions. The endemic plants, of course, are important because in one sense, they're ours to protect. They only live here, perhaps, or in some ecoregion that maybe we share with another state. But these are the ones that have a really tight geographic distribution and are restricted to some particular habitat or region. These are just a few examples. We have a number that are probably a dozen at least that have been described already, and that are endemic to Arkansas only of these plants. And then a bunch more that are endemic, say, to the Ouachitas. So there are maybe a few sites in Oklahoma as well, or some that are endemic to the Ozarks, a few sites in maybe Missouri as well. And, you know, what's endemic to a state is just a political concern, really. It's, you know, the plants don't care about boundaries of states. And then there's a number of others that are being described now, or I'm awaiting description, that are evidently endemic to Arkansas. And all this conservation status ranking and planning and the methods that we use to keep track and gather data of all these things are done in conjunction with a larger set of standards or network of programs, these state natural heritage programs in all the states, all use the same basic techniques and technology under the umbrella of an organization called NatureServe, which is basically like the umbrella group of all the heritage programs. It's actually a nonprofit. It used to be housed within the Nature Conservancy, but it split off about 20 years ago. But NatureServe is sort of, they define it like this: provide the scientific basis for effective conservation, and it has the network of heritage programs as the trusted source of information about rare, endangered species and threatened ecosystems. But like, just basically standardize the protocols, let us compare apples to apples, and do this ranking across the range of these species, so we know we're all talking about the same thing. A lot of the habitats in Arkansas are fire dependent. Not all of them. There are some that fire will damage, and the timing of fire is very important. You can do damage. It can be a great tool. It can also cause damage that you don't want. The intensity, the seasonality, all these things are factors. But without question, fire has been a part of Arkansas ecosystems for probably millions of years, certainly thousands of years with human management, 10,000 years. And then we put it back. It's a valuable tool. We put it back into these sites where it's appropriate and under the appropriate conditions as far as we understand. And it's kind of fun too. We get to go out and start fires, and you know, I joke at probably keeping a few firebugs out of trouble, giving that outlet on our staff. Also, invasive species are a major factor, and that's really another threat to biodiversity. So on the simplest level, yeah, you're adding species diversity every time a species is introduced, but over time, if that species or those species that are introduced can outcompete and change the ecosystems and alter the ecosystem processes like fire, or shade out species on the ground that need sun during part of their life cycle, you are diminishing the biodiversity, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing at a massive, exponentially increasing landscape level scale damage to a whole bunch of ecosystems from these non-native invasive plants. There's one called Chinese tallow tree that's become a real problem in southern Arkansas, especially in sort of open wetlands where it completely fills them in. And we spend a lot of time and effort and money controlling these things. Here's another example of sort of the kind of situation we have. The photo here in the upper, this is a Cave Springs Cave Natural Area. It's one of our properties in North Arkansas. And we actually bought the site because it has the largest population in the world of the Ozark blind cavefish. It lives underground in a wet cave system, spring-fed underground streams and lakes and stuff. And there's a series of sinkholes above ground. You can see that upper left photo has a grill that covers the sinkhole and goes down into the cave. And then the plant that's growing all around that sinkhole is a real invasive thing called winter creeper, Euonymus. It's a evergreen ground cover. It climbs the tree and makes a flower and fruit when it climbs on things, but it covers the entire ground in sort of a blanket of evergreen foliage. At the same site on the upper right, we have literally growing in that location a huge population of one of the rarest plants. It's endemic to Arkansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma, the Ozark Trillium. That's G3S3, is a pretty globally vulnerable, high-ranked species that we track. And it's being impacted by this evergreen ground cover. So it depends on sunlight from late February through April to do its growing and flowering, and it's being overtopped by this blanket of evergreen vegetation. And what we would normally do in this situation would be to come in during the winter when all the native flora is dormant, spray the Euonymus, the winter creeper, with a foliar herbicide that breaks down quickly, kill it all, and then just burn it off some year and, you know, burn it all up and be in good shape. But we can't use the herbicide there because there's this aquatic, you know, these sinkholes everywhere that feed this aquatic system. So we have to do this tedious management where we use a flamer to burn through there. We've done prescribed fire, but we also do a lot of pulling of this Euonymus. And in other cases, we have other situations that are different, and we do use a more heavy-handed approach. Like this is a Cudgel Eradication at Natchitoches Ravines, one of our special forest areas in South Arkansas, where we had about a 20-acre kudzu infestation along a highway where it was planted back in the 40s or 50s. And there's an herbicide called Transline that mostly affects plants in the bean and pea family, which is where kudzu, what kudzu is. And we sprayed that from a crop duster a few times and really knocked back the kudzu. And it didn't hurt the plants underneath, and they started to come back, and we've seen a real increase in stuff down there. And we don't do all this management without some sort of monitoring. So in the sites where we do a lot of management, we actually have permanent monitoring plots where we go in and sit out there and quantitatively measure different aspects of the vegetation to make sure it's moving in accordance with our management plan. And we monitor populations of rare species in these sites to make sure that they're not declining, that they're increasing or being stable, or whatever the goal is. And if they're not, we can change our management. We'll do something different. So it's an informed process, informed by science and monitoring. And of course, we don't just deal with plants, but that's today's topic, but we also monitor other things. Let's see, it's almost 10. You want to open it up for a few questions or take a 5-minute break or something?
Yeah, we have one question that Asha has asked. What does SH mean? I understand G3, but the SH,
right.
Maybe that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. So in addition to the numbers, there are some other ranks. So SH, H means historical. So if the only record of a species, or all the records of a species, are older than about, I think it's about 40 years or 30 to 40 years old, I forget exactly what the threshold is, we consider it to be a historic occurrence. So it's just a little designation to let us know we can't find it anymore. We know it was here historically. We know where it was historically in some cases, but it's either not there now, or it's not there now, or we can't find it. And that lets people know this is important to go after. So go find this. This is, you know, we actually have a little list on the wall, or we used to, of all the SH species in the state. And one by one, we find them, you know, we take them off and they become S1. And then there's another rank of SX, which means not only can you not find it, but you know that all the sites where it occurred have been destroyed, or the populations are gone. So that means it's extirpated. And then there's a GX, which is extinct entirely.
Okay.
Is that it?
That's also part. Does anybody have any questions? Here's one too. How was winter creeper introduced? Commercial trade, or was it commercial?
You got it. Yeah, absolutely. It's ornamental. Yeah, probably introduced in the 1800s when a lot of the Victorian gardening stuff was going on. They're bringing stuff over from Asia and Europe, South America, and you know, of the 700 something non-native plants, it's probably 120 of them are problems, and the rest kind of innocuous or only in lawns or whatever. But that one is running roughshod over huge parts of the state, Northwest Arkansas in particular.
Y'all feel free to chime in or unmute yourself to ask a question if you have audio. If not, then chat it out. Any control on ornamental sales?
Very little, but yes, the state plant board has banned certain species sale, like water hyacinth, for example.
Yeah.
Which is pretty bad already anymore. It's we were always, I learned in school it will never be a problem in Arkansas because the winters are too severe. Well, not anymore. It's now probably been 20 years in Lake Dardanelle and up the Arkansas River. It's all in the Ouachita River system. It's up the Maumelle River and big floating rafts, you know, out competing all the shoreline vegetation, aquatic vegetation. So maybe too little too late on that, but there's 2 or 3 other ones. Yeah, the state plant board has a few that are mostly ones that are potentially economically damaging, things that would mess up like forestry or agriculture mainly, things that would be bad weeds in pastures and stuff. Something called tropical soda apple that's been prohibited. I don't know why anyone would grow it, but Mostly no. To answer your question, Fayetteville, Arkansas has an invasive plant ordinance that at the local level. That's the most I've ever heard of anything like that in Arkansas. Well, maybe we should just allow breaks to happen. People just take a break if they want to take a break, or should we have an official break?
Let's take a 5-minute one just to do. So one more quick question. Okay. Does a group propagate the native orchids? Does that happen?
I don't know of anyone in Arkansas doing it. So in other states, and I would love to see this happen in Arkansas, other states have things called plant conservation alliances, PCAs, which are nonprofits that specifically target the rarest species and managing sites. So that maybe there's a small bog or a steep or some little wetland that has a bunch of rare orchids or pitcher plants or something, something really site specific. And maybe it's on private land, or maybe it's a little site owned by a land trust and there's no money for management. The PCA gets together and works on those sites. And in other states, they've partnered with botanical gardens. Like I've done a lot of work with some folks in Georgia, where they're doing with the Atlanta Botanical Garden is growing orchids, which is very hard to do. It's not like growing most other plants. You've got to have a fungus that you grow with it, and you got to germinate it in a sterile tissue lab and all. I mean, they do all that stuff in partnership with the botanical garden. But individual private citizens run this program, this PCA, and they go out and reintroduce these orchids to sites where they've been extirpated or declined, and they manage it, they burn them, and they clear the brush out. And I mean, it's incredible. We don't have anything quite that organized here, but there's been a few little things, not with orchids, but with other stuff, where they've rescued plants from, rare plants from a site that's going to be destroyed and moved them and that kind of thing. So, no, not exactly, but sort of.
Okay. So we want to take.
Well, there've been some orchid rescues. Let me back up. There's been some lady slipper orchid transplanting that's gone on. I don't know if that was mostly agency people or maybe some volunteers, but there's been a couple sites. When they expanded Lake Fort Smith and Lake Fort Smith State Park a few years ago, they made the lake a lot bigger, and it inundated a population of Kentucky lady slippers, and those were moved to another site above the lake. And I think it was partially successful, at least, so sort of.
Okay. So I don't see any more questions right now. So what if it's 10:02, what if we come back in literally 5 minutes? Is that good?
Sounds
Get
good.
some coffee, whatever? Okay, thanks. Yep. I don't hear anything. I don't know.
Sorry, I had muted it.
Oh, good.
Thank you. I was saying something. So GIS, it stands for Geographic Information Systems, or Geographic Information Science. And it's the computer mapping technology that everybody uses anymore to do any sort of conservation work or understanding and mapping of the natural world. And we use a platform called ArcGIS, which is an expensive sort of high-end, very capable thing. But anybody who uses Google Earth is using a GIS. So in fact, I use Google Earth about as much as I use the high-end thing now. So anybody can get this for free, except for whatever spying they do on you. And it's a really powerful tool. I mean, this has revolutionized field science, botany, zoology, everything, just completely revolutionized it, and allows us to find places that are important and understand things in a way that we just couldn't do. Even 20 years ago when I started, this was basic in its infancy, at least at our place. And what we can do now with the handheld GPS unit, for example, how accurate you can get a point versus when we used to just put a dot on a map best we could. It's phenomenal, and it's been great for conservation. So this analysis is done on a backdrop typically of aerial imagery. I like the aerial infrared, the color infrared winter imagery that I talked about. We use it in that ArcGIS format. We can analyze, like right now I'm working on a huge project. It's going to be a couple years long, looking at, we're calling a natural heritage inventory of 2 whole counties, of Benton and Washington County in Northwest Arkansas. That region is being developed at a pace that is unbelievable. It's the fastest growing area in the whole region. They're adding 1,000 people a month for the last several years. The sprawl is significant, and it's really the last chance to go in and really, determine what is going to be protected and what's going to be lost. And to do that, we want to have a really detailed understanding of what is in those counties left to protect, and so that we can make informed decisions on where we're going to buy land or work with the municipalities to protect sites and watersheds and so on. So looking at those counties, in part in GIS, at a sort of 1 mile by 1 mile grid level, which is just a convenient, practical way. There's this grid already set up, the public land survey system, and we can go in and look at those sites. At that level, you can see the things you need to see and try to map either areas that need to be looked at, they might be significant, or areas that clearly have a rare habitat or known rare species sites and so on, or are relatively intact even. So this is very useful for that sort of work. And we have all these different data layers we can bring in: topographic map, the geology, soils layers, that sort of thing that I talked about. You can bring in that rare species and community data from the Natural Heritage Program. We've got different kinds of aerial imagery is really useful for mapping things like open glades or cedar glades, or crowded with cedar, you can see that. Different types of forests, wetlands. And there's all these other data sets that we can bring in. So just as an example, there's a mile by mile grid I showed earlier. There, look at that aerial infrared. You can see the hardwood woodland, you can see the hardwood forest, you can see the pine hardwood forest, you can see the pine forest. You can see the different slopes and aspects. Bringing that topographic data, you can map the bluffs. You can map these natural communities without even going to them, sort of a predicted mapping of the different forest types or whatever, different community types. And then you can go out in the field and sort of verify that and refine your models. There's a lot of computer modeling going on now that is using algorithms based in known data from known points, using these algorithms to map. We were working with the Game and Fish Commission and the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Nature Conservancy and some other partners. Probably start next year, assuming funding. Everything's up in the air with any kind of government funding right now. But if we get the funding we were expecting to get before the COVID thing hit, we're going to do a wall-to-wall mapping over probably 5 years of Arkansas at a pretty fine level, like this kind of level here, and map all the natural communities. We would hire that out to someone who does it all the time professionally and really knows what they're doing. But have a habitat map like that would be a game changer in Arkansas. Map the little wetlands. You can map predict where the seeps might be, and that's complicated more than it seems. I'll talk about them in a minute, about the geology and stuff. Glades and barrens, rocky ridge lines, open woodlands, barrens. You add all that together, you can map special places or likely special places. Talked a lot, I think, in my ecoregions talk back in February about grasslands and how important grasslands are. I'll reiterate all that again. Grasslands are, as a broad sort of ecosystem type, really the most biodiverse, with a few forest exceptions. There's some really biodiverse forest types, but they're not common here. But as a general sense, the most biodiverse sort of broad class of ecosystems, and also the most endangered and threatened. So real high priority for conservation. And the way we define grasslands now might be a little different than a lot of people have in their head or learned in school. It's a little broader definition to include sort of the really open woodland communities or savannas, as well as, treeless areas. So they don't have to necessarily be treeless. And that's important because, for example, I love this definition here. Grasslands is any community in which the grass layer with its associated forbs, and forbs are broadleaf wildflowers, is the dominant layer in terms of either total, total cover or biomass, or both. And then another sort of part of the definition be, in some instances, you can have trees and shrubs that emerge above the canopy of herbaceous plants to form savannas, and it's still a grassland. I call them treed grasslands or wooded grasslands or whatever. But even in those situations, like you might have, I'll show a picture of a post oak savannas and woodlands in a minute, where in the tree canopy there's literally maybe 2 or 3 species of tree in the whole place. But on the ground, there's 300 species of herbaceous grasses and plant and broadleaf forbs and so on. So that is really a grassland with some trees up in it. It's totally, if the trees went away, the only reason it has trees in it is the soil's fertile enough to grow trees. But historically, it was open savanna, and we do a lot of restoration of that. That's great for all the wildlife, especially. So people say, well, we talk about grasslands. We still have grasslands, right? I mean, I see grasslands. And in a sense, yeah, there's still open areas, and some of these used to be open prairie with hundreds of species, and today they're, in this case, a lawn or a golf course or a fescue pasture with just very few species on the ground, the plants, and they're, been repurposed for other uses. They are dominated by grass, but they're nothing like what we used to have. Here's another example. This is the Grand Prairie of East Arkansas. This was 500,000 acres of extremely biodiverse prairie and savanna. Even 150 years ago, even 100 years ago, a lot of this was still intact. In the 1930s, they discovered that the soils there were perfect for growing rice. And the reason that they're good for rice is there's a clay lens in the soil, what we call hard pan, about 1 foot or 18 inches down. It's a really tight clay layer, and water won't go through it. So if you put a levee around a field and flood it, if it's flat, it'll just hold water. And that's perfect for growing rice. It's also the reason it was a prairie. We have enough rainfall in Arkansas that you would expect forest everywhere. So everywhere we had these extensive grasslands, and we had probably 2 million acres of treeless grassland historically, and a lot more than that of these sort of wooded grasslands. Everywhere you have those, there is some soil factor at play as well, or some landscape geomorphology factor, like these broad plains where a fire would start and burn for months or weeks over huge areas, and tip the balance sort of in favor of the grassland flora. So there's a lot of factors at play, but in most of the big prairie areas, there's a clay or rock layer in the soil that's pretty shallow and restricts root penetration and makes it wet in the spring and really dry in the summer. And that tips the balance along with fire for the grasslands. But that's nothing like the grasslands we used to have. Yes, it's an area dominated by grass, but this is Baker Prairie Natural Area where you have 300 species of grassland plants, many of them rare today, only found in these ancient prairies. And this is really, we have this, people understand the concept of an old growth forest. This is an old growth grassland. So these are thousands of years old. And if you look close, you can you can see all these different species in flower. And this is a snapshot in June. But from the last freeze of the spring to the first freeze of the fall, there are many species in flower all the time in these high quality prairies. And the biodiversity of the flora is then the foundation for the biodiversity of the insect communities that nectar on these plants, the birds that eat the seeds, that need the cover provided by the native flora. And it's just outstanding. It must have been something to see 200 years ago when huge swaths of the state were in this condition. This Baker Prairie is the last 70 acres of chert prairie in a site that used to be about 7,000 acres. I talk about these wooded grasslands. This is a post oak woodland or post oak savanna in the Boston Mountains in the Ozark National Forest. Those are old trees, probably a couple hundred years old. And you see on the ground a continuous layer, 100%, or it's actually not 100% cover, but 80 to 90% cover of perennial grassland flora. I see a coneflower. I see a bunch of woodland sunflowers, the dominant thing you're seeing there. There's all sorts of stuff in these habitats. And they're prairie plants. Like the grass in the foreground there is big bluestem, which is one of the common Warm season prairie grasses. It's the foundation of all of our prairies of any soil depth. And there it is as the dominant under these old growth post oak trees. We see some ironweed in there and a lot of woodland sunflower. But these are wooded grasslands. The diversity is not in those trees. It's all post oak. So we have various types of,
One question that may, before you go on, how does carbon sequestration of grassland compare to forest?
Actually can be very high. The prairies and forests they sequester carbon in different ways, right? So trees put the carbon in the wood, and grasslands put the carbon in the soil. So all through the soil, there's all these what you see above ground of these grassland plants is just the above ground part. Sometimes there's equal the amount of biomass, or in deeper soils, more biomass of roots in the soil. And it's putting carbon into those roots, and they die over time, and it sequesters that into the soil. So it builds it from the roots into the ground. And there's a lot of studies going on right now about that exact question, like how good are grasslands at sequestering carbon as opposed to forest? And because, for example, that's a concern, right? You go in and thin the forest out, you're taking some carbon out, and then you're releasing some carbon, and then you're burning, and that's releasing carbon. But over time, there's good evidence in certain ecosystems, at least, there's a net sequestration of carbon. So it could be pretty interesting. There's a whole nother talk, really, but pretty good stuff. Types of open grasslands in Arkansas. Just, this is a kind of a lumpy approach. You could split out a lot more types, but for a 3-hour discussion, tallgrass prairies, blackland prairies, which is sort of a subclass of tallgrass prairie, but on a high pH soil in southwest Arkansas. The rock glades and barrens, of which there are many types. The saline barrens I talked about, naturally saline outcrop thin soil grasslands. We call these, in the West, they would call these alkali flats or alkali barrens, salt flats. And we have that here. It's just really rare. And a lot of Western stuff in those. It's kind of interesting. Sand barrens on really deep sand. It's really well drained. It becomes really dry in the summer. Sort of a desert-like grassland as well. We have scour prairies or scour barrens, or sometimes just called river scour, which are these high gradient river ring grasslands. I'll get into those a little bit. Sandbars on the big rivers, which are mostly gone. We still have some of that habitat, but like on the Arkansas River, it's mostly been lost to the river channelization projects and flood control projects and navigation projects. It's really sort of changed they have to have periodic flooding and movement of the river in order to be maintained. A lot of rare species associated with those. And then a whole variety of marsh types. So these are open wetlands that are flooded and in part dominated by flooding. And then sort of the wooded types. There's a pine flatwood savanna. There's an upland pine woodland savanna, shortleaf pine bluestem woodland, oak woodlands, flatwoods. I talked about flatwoods some in that talk back in February. If we have time, I'll recap that. Upland oak woodlands, like I showed a minute ago, those post oak woodlands, sandhill woodlands on deep sand, just a few types there. I like this slide. It sort of illustrates this idea that much of the upland parts of the state, historically, they had trees, but it was much more open than what we know today. So, and you can see that in the level of biodiversity on the ground. And I'll recap this. I talked a little about it last time. Let me kind of recap it here. Historically, we know there was a lot of what you see in the upper right. And again, that's a post oak, black hickory woodland. There's 2 or 3 species of trees and a continuous grassland flora on the ground. Today, in those same kinds of places where that used to be, you see something more like the lower left. And you can see that the trees in that photo, the big canopy trees, are not tall, straight forest trees. They're open-grown woodland trees, and they grew without a lot of dense competition. Those are old post oaks. But underneath, you see this dense mid-story of shade-suppressed woody plants. And on the ground is where the real story is. So plants need a couple of things. They need light, they need nutrients, and they need space. So it's just like the basic breakdown of all of that thing, of those things. And what we're seeing over much of these upland ecosystems today is on the ground is this lower right side. Let me go back. No, let me go forward. Okay. That's a 1 meter by 1 meter square on the ground of one of these shortleaf pine post oak woodlands. And you see typically, this is from a study that was done in the Boston Mountains on the Ozark National Forest, but you see about 5 species per meter square on the ground, and it's all shade suppressed woody plants. I see a sassafras seedling there. There's some Virginia creeper, poison ivy, which is usually the dominant plant. There's a little hickory seedling or sapling and maybe a maple there. So that's kind of what I'm seeing in this picture. None of those things are flowering. There's no nectar resource there. None of them are making fruit. They're just in this suspended animation waiting for some trees to blow down, in which case they'll grow up. And then the other thing you're seeing there is this dense accumulation of compressed leaf litter. Decades and decades worth of leaves that fell and got compressed together in a mat. And it's just like mulching your garden. You mulch your garden to control plants from growing up that you don't want. And what has essentially happened over huge swaths of the state, or the whole region, the whole eastern part of the country, is we've mulched the woodland completely, and it's grown together in the canopy. So you have this shade, unnaturally high levels of shade that the plants native to the ecosystem can't endure. Most of the plants native to these upland woodlands need sun. They're sun-loving plants. There's not a lot of shade-loving plants that can take these dry conditions, these dry, rocky woods. And so you just don't see much blooming, and it's become kind of a sterile environment. There's not very many species. There's no nectar resource. There's no fruit or seeds for wildlife, and so on. By contrast, when we restore these woodlands back to a more open condition, thinning out, say, half of the trees or a third of the trees, depending, and reintroducing fire to remove that accumulated leaf litter, we see 3 to 4 times the number of plants on the ground. And it's not these shade-suppressed woody plants. It's all sorts of woodland sunflowers and sedges and grasses and beans and peas and all these things that flower, that produce nectar, that produce hard seeds and soft fruits and all sorts of things for the wildlife. All the biodiversity at every level we sample, whether it's birds or reptiles and amphibians or insects or mammals, all of them much higher in these restored woodlands. And the main factor that's missing from the landscape today is fire. And we know that there was regular fire historically, both from lightning strikes, which was very seasonal. Well, lightning strikes all the time, but they start fires primarily based on the research. And when they start fires today is August, September, October, which is the time of year that lightning fires would have been very prominent in the landscape. And then Native Americans have been burning, at least 10,000 years in this landscape, primarily in the late fall and winter, based on the evidence. So frequent low intensity fire maintains these open woodlands in a really healthy condition. And that's what we strive to do. There are other ecosystem processes that were historically common in certain ecoregions that are gone today, and these include bison, which are completely gone, elk, and of course we still have deer. In fact, we have maybe unnaturally high numbers of deer now, but these all exert impacts on things. And then in our riverine systems, these systems evolved with frequent, or at least periodic, intense flooding for long duration that flooded these whole floodplains, that deposited nutrients, that altered the vegetation, that allowed a lot of the fish species to get out of the channel into shallow backwaters and spawn. This is a vital ecosystem process to all of our larger rivers and streams, especially out of the really rugged parts of the mountains. And this is no longer happens except in extreme events like this flooding of the White River a couple of years ago, which was, I think, a record or near record event. But most of these rivers have levees on them. They have locks and dams, various structures that keep them going. Then we have, I this is a review from last time, I think, but I want to go back through it because it's so important, is if you want to understand plants in Arkansas, you need to think of the landscape along what I call the prairie to forest continuum. So on one extreme, we have treeless grasslands of various types. On the other extreme, we have natural closed canopy forests. And much of the landscape, really those two, it's like a bell curve almost. Like if you think about, there's a bell curve distributed along this continuum, there was, you know, a certain amount of treeless grasslands, it was a minority of the landscape. There's a certain amount of closed canopy forest. Again, probably a minority of the landscape, except maybe in the Mississippi alluvial plain. And then a lot of the middle of the landscape, especially in our upland communities, was in between that prairie and forest. And that's a big take home for understanding the loss of plant biodiversity in our landscape. So on one hand, we had the treeless prairie, places like Baker Prairie, and even that's not treeless. You can see there's little wooded draws and so on. Perfectly adapted to fire. Most of the plant's perennial. There's annuals as well, but a lot of it's perennial stuff. The fire would come through in the late summer, fall, or winter and clean all the above ground biomass off. And then every successive wave of species that grew through the year is taller than the last. So if you go out in March, everything's ankle high. You go out in April, it's knee high. You go out in May, it's waist high. And every successive wave of species that flowers is taller than the last. It grows higher to get above and get sunlight, make its flowers available to the pollinators, its seeds available to the birds and other animals that move things around, the wind. And then by the end of the summer, you've got compass plant that's 8 feet tall and big blue stem that's 8 feet tall. And it's perfectly adapted ecosystem. You had the blackland prairies of the coastal plain, where you basically had treeless ridges and woodlands in the draws between and the little drainages. We call these tall grass prairies because they're dominated by 4 species of tall grass. There are, of course, many, many other grasses, 100 plus in these grasslands, but these are sort of the backbone species of most of our prairie and open savanna systems. Switchgrass, Indian grass, big blue stem or turkey foot, and little blue stem. But they're known especially for their incredible diversity of sun-loving, long-lived, mostly perennial, the perennials are long-lived, some of the annuals, of course, are not, but just incredible diversity of wildflowers. Things like a bunch of different blazing stars, 2 species of Indian paintbrush, one of my favorites, lots of beans and peas, legumes in these habitats, but this is a great one called sensitive briar. The leaves will close when you touch them at the slightest touch, like a Venus flytrap, but it does not eat insects. We got 5 species of echinacea. We got 21 native milkweeds, several species of rosinweed or compass plant. We've got 8 or so species of beard tongues, a bunch of different black-eyed Susans or Rudbeckias. We got 3 species of meadow beauty, 16 native sunflowers, 5 false indigos. There's another milkweed. And there's also, and a lot of these are found only in these open woodlands, grasslands, etc. They're not in closed canopy forests. These are sun-loving plants, and they will not survive, certainly will not flower in the deep shade. There are certain animal species that are found only in grasslands. We have a rare turtle, the Ornate Box Turtle, which if you've seen, you've seen something rare. They're very rare today. This was the Prairie Box Turtle that we had. It's only known from a few places anymore. And birds like the greater prairie chicken, thought to be extirpated from Arkansas until it was found on Fort Chaffee a few years ago in western Arkansas, but pretty much extinct, functionally extinct from Arkansas. Yeah, other species like Ozark pocket gopher, an endemic gopher in parts of the Ozarks. Black-tailed jackrabbit, maybe gone from Arkansas, maybe hanging on in a few prairies in the western river valley. Where were the prairies? This is a map I think I showed last time. The red or orange there shows the large prairie areas that were mapped in the original land survey in the early 1800s. And the blue are large concentrations of open glade communities. So kind of a rough idea of treeless grassland distribution. The glades are shown larger than they are in real life, just so you can see them at this scale. But that's 9 different types of glades, sort of all represented on the same map. And then the prairies there. The big prairie was the Grand Prairie in East Arkansas. There are extensive prairies historically along the Western River Valley near Charleston, Fort Smith area, Benton and Washington County in the northwest part of the state, around Rogers and Fayetteville, Siloam Springs, big prairies up there, scattered back to the east across the Ozarks, southwest Arkansas and the Blackland Prairies, and then scattered up and down east Arkansas here and there as well. We have the xeric sand barrens, which is another deep sand grassland, extremely biodiverse. We have a wonderful natural area, which I encourage you to all go visit, called Miller County Sandhills. Miller County Sandhills is a small natural area. It's maybe 200 acres. But even looking at a very small subset of that natural area, probably as little as 20 acres, is the highest concentration of state-listed rare plants in the state. There's 44 tracked species on about 20 acres down there. It's absolutely incredible. Many of them are globally rare. There was a new one described new to science last year, a species of ground cherry, called the sandhill ground cherry. Absolutely incredible sight. You can see how beautiful it is in flower. The rock glades and barrens, another type, and again, they're classified based on the geologic substrate. These are our true desert grasslands with the toughest, most drought-adapted desert plants that we have in the flora. This is a really rare species called the Virginia nailwort. It's found in West Texas and shale barrens of Virginia, and then some shale barrens and other rock outcrop communities on sandstone, and a little bit of limestone in Arkansas, and that's it. And it is the toughest plant. It blooms the last week of August in full sun in no soil, just right out of the rock. It's absolutely incredible. This is a site on Lake Washita and a really high quality shale barrens. Moving on down that continuum, we get to Savannah. So think of this as prairie with scattered trees in it. And the biodiversity in these is actually higher than a treeless prairie if it's open enough, because you have both that treeless prairie flora, and in the shades of these trees, you'll start picking up some of the woodland flora and the birds that need that scattered structure. You might have shrub thickets scattered out through here, lots of tree resprouts from fire, and big old fire-tolerant trees like these post oaks out in through there. This is an example of a restored savanna at Terra Noir Natural Area down in Clark County. Those are big old trees, probably a couple hundred years old, post oaks, chinkapin oaks, surrounded by open grassland, and then in the draws, there's sort of little woodlands. The best place to see savanna in Arkansas is on Fort Chaffee. This is the largest sort of intact grassland landscape in Arkansas left. There are tens of thousands of acres of high quality to good quality grassland in its nearly natural state, I guess. This is a wonderful site. Again, that barren area in the middle of the photo is not a bulldozer scrape. That is a natural saline or alkali barrens, saline barrens. And around that is a short grass, basically what we call a saline glade community. Surrounding that is a tall grass prairie, oak savanna, and then the ridges have sort of oak woodland on them. And there's tens of thousands of acres of this out there. It's all restricted access, difficult to get in. I had to go through safety training, have a military escort every time I've gone out there. But it's well worth the hassle because it is unlike anything we have left. There's nothing left at this scale like this. And it's absolutely incredible. I mean, you get out there, this is one of the sort of savanna ridges out there, or slope, and you can see that plant that's all out there is a really rare lily called death camas, super toxic to eat, but it's uncommon. It's not quite considered a species of concern, but it's close. And if usually you find a couple of plants, you get excited. It's such a rare thing to find. Out there, it's by the millions in these savannas, and it's just phenomenal. Again, fire dependent landscape scale. And the reason that it's in high quality is because this is adjacent to and on a big bombing range complex. And they start fires all the time. And then they light prescribed fires as well on purpose to manage the landscape and keep it sort of at a low fire risk all the time. But it does burn every year or two over pretty much this whole area of the base. And it's what it looked like out there when Thomas Nuttall went through this area 200 years ago and described the savannas, except now there's blown up tanks laying around. That's the only difference. But there's rare plants all up under there. There's 5 or 6 track species probably in this frame around this blown up tank. Absolutely phenomenal. Moving down the continuum, we have woodland. And when I say woodland and I say forest, I'm talking about two different things, basically. So a woodland is a open enough forest, or there's enough opening in the canopy that there's a pretty good light coming to the ground. I would say less than 80% canopy closure, canopy cover, anywhere from maybe 40 to 80% cover, something like that in there. And these can occur in a variety of different landscapes. They can be in these big broad flats, these flat woods along the prairie. They can be on slopes and ridges. They can be around the margins of these glades or between the glade openings, but they are open enough that light is hitting the ground and there's good ground cover, and it's fire prone enough to sort of be in a maintained condition as long as you keep fire in that equation on some periodic return. And this is an example of that. This is at Fort Chaffee again. Ozark National Forest again. Seen those. Same thing. You can see in the foreground, in the background, it's kind of lost in the greenery, but in the foreground, you can see a bunch of spiderworts and some phlox and some woodland sunflower. All is not blooming yet, but that's the dominant there. Some prairie grasses. There's butterfly milkweed. But that same site across the road will look something like this. And this is that fire-suppressed, closed-in woodland that's dominating the landscape today. And again, pine, post oak, low diversity in the canopy, nothing on the ground. And then it sort of showed the same, I showed the bottom two slides already, but this is the same, the thing to know is this is the same hillside on the two halves of the photo, the right and left half of the screen. And you've got that unrestored 80 years of no management versus the thinned and burned stand on the same slope, same aspect, same soil, same age of trees, etc. And you can really see the difference. This is an aerial infrared photo of a high quality savanna and woodland ecosystem. And actually you can see some forest as well. So just to give you some context, I'll use my cursor again. This is a stream in a valley, in like a kind of a, I'm not gonna say a ravine. I mean, it's probably a half a mile from the ridge up here to this over here, maybe more. But anyway, you see this whole slope here is a south-facing slope. This is on Camp Robinson, just north of Little Rock. And then this down here is a north-facing slope on the other side of the creek. And you can see the forest, the tree density is much higher on the north-facing slope than the south. What you're seeing on the south-facing slope is in white, treeless grassland or open savanna, and the gray dots are individual post oak trees and a few pines scattered in. So you're seeing how open it is on the south-facing slope and ridge, and then much more closed over here on, again, a north-facing slope. But this is some of the highest quality oak woodland left in Arkansas. And again, the same reason is this is on a military installation where fires are ignited and then allowed to burn. So in the very bottom of the photo is a mortar range where fires get started regularly and burn across the landscape. And then they use prescribed fire as well. And then on the other extreme, we do have natural closed canopy forest. And these forests are, can you guys hear dishes clanking in the background? Is it a problem? Okay.
We can hear them, but I don't think it's a problem.
Okay.
Yeah, it's okay.
I'll tell you what, I'm going to pause for like 2 minutes and go to a different room. Sorry about that. Yeah. Okay, sorry about that. Challenges of working from home. So on the other extreme, we have this closed canopy natural forests, and these are natural, but they occur in specific landscape positions, typically in places where either the landform is dissected or it's wetter, or for whatever reason, it's more fire protected. So when fires would burn on the landscape, they would either go out in these habitats or were just less intense, or some reason that they didn't burn through and keep them more open. And these occur in places like riparian areas along streams, bottomland forest systems, lower north-facing and east-facing slopes, below bluff lines and deep hollows or box canyons in the mountains, some kind of places where it's just more protected. And you know you're in one because the flora is shade tolerant on the ground. So you can be in an upland woodland that has a closed canopy forest, but there's nothing, the plants that can survive in those sites, they don't have sun, they drop out. But when you're in a natural forest, the plants on the ground are adapted to life in the shade. They still flower, they make fruit, seed, etc. And a lot of them are the spring ephemerals that bloom in that period between the last frost and the leaf out of the hardwood trees. We typically don't have natural pine forests because the pines need open habitat to get established. And most of our natural forests are hardwood, just dominated by deciduous trees. And you get things on the ground like all your spring ephemeral wildflowers, a lot of your trilliums. You get things like this Dutchman's breeches, this hepatica, the harbinger of spring, things like. So a lot of these plants are adapted to do all their growing early in that window between deep shade and the frost. And they'll grow really fast out of the ground during that period. They'll flower during that period. And then they're kind of done. They just make seed and hang out. Or they'll die quickly. Like this Dutchman's breeches will be gone by the first part of summer. But it's a perennial. It comes back every year from the root, but it does all its stuff in that early spring window. There's some other plants that can stick around in the shade that are just more shade tolerant, like this ginseng. So ginseng blooms in the summer and puts on fruit into the fall, but it's adapted to life in these closed canopy forests. A couple other forest things here. A lot of the bitter cresses and toothworts. A lot of the lilies are true forest species. Some of them aren't, but this is one called Woods False hellebore that likes that sort of habitat. Well, there's a glade picture there. It's going to pass. Oh, I guess I'm getting into the glades. We did a project a few years ago where we mapped all the glades in Arkansas and Missouri. They did Missouri first, and then we had the same ecologists map them all in Arkansas. And it's been a revolutionary product that's allowed us to just to know where they are. We didn't even know where they all were. We didn't know the different types we had. We knew the types we had, but we didn't know what was where. So there are 9 types illustrated on the glade map. This isn't even the final version, I don't think. But again, it is exaggerated in size. So this is like without an exaggerated border versus the exaggerated border. But lets us know where they are. It's pretty valuable. The different types based on geology, the shale barrens occur in the Ouachitas, but also in the Ozarks. They're different communities. The ones in the Ouachitas are among the rarest and highest biodiversity ecosystems of anything in the state, probably anything in the region, if not all of Eastern North America. Really, really hot spots. Lots of endemics, several species new to science, lots of just rare things, lots of great flora, a lot of blooms. And they're true desert habitats, all of these glades. They have desert plants that you expect in the Southwest, things like yucca. We have 4 species of native yucca, and make sure that's right. Yeah, 4 natives and 2 non-natives that are sort of introduced around old home sites and stuff. But the native ones are always in these rocky grasslands, glades, bluffs, that kind of place. We have 4 native prickly pear cactus. We got a new one for the state a couple years ago in Limestone Glades in Benton County, which is exciting because it's a big one. It has, the cactus up there 3 feet tall with a pad that's 10 inches across, way bigger than the ones you've probably seen in other areas. That's a rare one that's sort of disjunct from Texas. But we have 3 that are across the broader part of the state. We have desert succulents like Widow's Cross, and a couple of native sedums that occur in these habitats. Some desert shrubs like buckbrush, some things like wild poinsettia, really desert genera that you think of being out west. We have a lot of diversity, including a couple probably new species in the genus Femoranthes. These are the fame flowers or rock pinks. They're desert species that have succulent leaves that hold water to get through the dry part of the summer. And you can see they grow in essentially no soil in these outcrops. And then this plant on the right is a wonderful desert succulent. It's a true agave. It's in different genus now, but it's you call it Eastern agave or Arkansas agave or Eastern aloe, false aloe. It's a really succulent leaf. I talked about the nailwort before as an example of a tough perennial. But these Ouachita shale barrens are just phenomenally diverse. They have so many rare species. I talked about the G ranks earlier, the G5 being common somewhere, but maybe an S1 here, S2. And then there's the other ones that are G3, G2, and G1. Anything in that G1 to G3 range is considered of global concern. We call it globally rare. And of the rare plants known from these Ouachita shale barrens, 19 of them, and these are just the ones that have been described. Again, there's several that are being worked up, but those are globally rare as well as just rare in the state. So this is the very important habitat for globally rare things. And this is a big one. This is probably the largest single glade complex we know of in the Ouachitas. There were a lot of them occur right around Lake Ouachita, and it's pretty clear that there were even bigger ones that are now under the lake. These lakes have really hit the glades hard in both the Ozarks and the Ouachitas. But there are some pretty spectacular remnants that go right down to the lake shore in places. And this is one of them. This is called Little Fur Barrens over in Montgomery County. And this is a shot I took from a helicopter at one of these glades over there. And you can see the dark green and sort of yellowish green, like those are cedar trees. And the story about glades in Arkansas is with grazing. There's a lot of heavy open range grazing historically. And when we still had open savannas and grasslands, the combination of heavy grazing where cattle would go in or goats or whatever and eat down all the grass to the soil, that allowed cedar to get established in a lot of these glades. And after that happened, there's a period of fire exclusion or fire suppression throughout the landscape. It kept the cedar from getting removed. It's pretty easy to remove young cedar with fire. It's really effective. And that's probably what kept cedar out, at least largely, of these ecosystems historically. There were not a lot of cedar in the glades, we know from the land survey and stuff and early accounts. They were mostly along bluffs on these rivers. And since with widespread fire suppression, the cedars have moved off the bluffs and really steep rocky slopes and gotten into all of our glades and literally choked them out. So we've lost any soil deep enough to grow a cedar tree. We've lost the native grassland flora from those sites. And it starts out kind of with the little cedars invading, and over time they get big, and it's a closed canopy, and it's again an evergreen, so it's shading all year, and you just lose your flora on the ground in these glades. This is a really high quality wet shale barrens at Middle Fork Barrens Natural Area where we have removed the cedar. And we've done that in a lot of places. The glades have, again, the highest concentrations of the globally rare endemics. These are just a few examples. The Nuttall's corn salad in the upper right is just known from glades and barrens in the Ouachitas and a little bit of the Ozarks and Arkansas Valley. The plant on the right is the open ground whittlowwort. It's a little mustard that grows in these glades. And the plant on the lower left is a very rare endemic. That's Arkansas, or Sebacia arkansana. It's Pelton's rose gentian. It was named for a guy named John Pelton, who was an amateur photographer and
native plant enthusiast. He was active in the Native Plant Society. He passed away last year, but he found that new to science and showed it to me, and we named it after him. This is a few more endemics. This is the Ouachita blazing star in the upper left, known only from the Ouachita Mountains of Arkansas. The upper right is Nuttall's pleatleaf, a rare iris relative that lives in glades in Arkansas and Missouri and Oklahoma. It's the largest population in the world, as far as we know, is Middle Fork Barrens Natural Area. The lower right is the Ouachita Mountain blue star, which grows in river scour barrens and wet glades. And then on the left, lower left, is Amorpha washitensis, the Ouachita indigo bush, another one of glades and barrens. One of the rarest types of glades we have are the nepheline syenite glades. These are, nepheline syenite is an igneous rock similar to granite, and Granite Mountain in Little Rock is named for this. And they're gradually quarrying away that entire mountain. And eventually this is going to be only left probably in Gillum Park and some sites in Saline County that the Nature Conservancy owns. It'll be all that's left of these. They're mostly gone already, and the ones that are left are great conservation value. The yellow flower there is pretty uncommon. That's a thing called golden selenia, a little mustard that blooms very early in the season, February, March. You can see the trees have not even leafed out yet. It's essentially the very early stage of spring. You can see prickly pear cactus is all scattered out in that as well. This is where we were going to go hiking if we didn't have the restrictions on. And we'll do it again sometime. I'll take you in there some other time when this is passed. This is the largest nepheline syenite glade left. It's the Donahue Preserve. It's a Nature Conservancy site in Saline County. There's about a 20-acre glade opening there. It's pretty impressive. A lot of really rare plants, including the Pelton's rose gentian, one of just a couple sites in the world. In the Ouachita Mountains, in the rugged parts where there's novaculite bedrock, we have novaculite glades. Novaculite's a kind of high silica-rich chert rock, really tight grain. It's what they use to make the sharpening stones or whetstones. It's also was favored by Native Americans as a spear point material. There are a number of historical quarries and sites where this was mined in prehistoric times for that purpose. This is an incredible novaculite glade that we worked on a few years ago in the Jack Mountains, which is south of Hot Springs, owned by the Ross Foundation, and had a bunch of really rare plants. This is where we found that rare fern I was talking about, Wright's Cliff Break. And then we have sandstone glades and woodlands, and there's different pHs of these different rocks. So the sandstone's real acidic, and this is a sandstone glade and woodland on Crystal Mountain in Saline County. You can see the prairie grasses all on the upper slope there, and the sort of stunted oak bushes that still have their leaves on them they hold their leaves through the winter when they're small. This is taken in the winter. You can see all the rock outcrops. This is Flatside Pinnacle, or no, North Fork Pinnacle again. You can see it's kind of a savanna on that south slope around those. There's actually a different community altogether. I called it a sandstone glade and woodland, but we've since sort of split this community out. It's called the Ouachita Mountain Sandstone Outcrop Barrens. We have this vertical rock structure and these little thickets of shrubs and all these rare plants in pockets of the rock and desert ferns everywhere. Really spectacular. And these are grasslands. I mean, they have this, the grasses you see on this rock outcrop on a ridge over above Lake Winona are the same four grasses that are the dominants in our prairies. There's big blue stem, little blue stem, switchgrass, and Indian grass right there on that rocky outcrop. And then there's that endemic Ouachita blazing star with a fritillary on it in one of those outcrop barrens. Just a few examples of those. There's Lake Winona in the distance. And then up in the Ozarks, where we have a lot of limestone, we have limestone glades. And these are totally different. They have a really different flora. There's a lot of species in common, but a lot of species on the limestone glades that are not found in the sandstone because of the high pH and the different soil chemistry. In fact, these are more diverse almost always than the sandstone acidic glades. And here you see a bunch of purple coneflower and some delphinium in the background. That's up at Devil's Eyebrow, which is one of our big new preserves up there. We've got about 3,500 acres now on the north side of Beaver Lake, connecting the Mark Twain National Forest in Missouri, right on the border with Beaver Lake now. Pretty great site. If you've heard people in Ozarks, you've heard of bald knobs. That is because there used to be a lot of treeless knobs and ridges in the White River Hills section, their ecoregion up there. That was because they're big glades. And today, again, we've lost a lot of that to the cedar encroachment. There's a lot of endemic and rare species up there. This is an endemic larkspur called the Trelease's larkspur. It's found only in a handful of counties in Missouri and Arkansas in dolomite glades, which is a type of limestone. And this is an evening rain lily, a silky aster, a royal catchfly, all rare species of these glade and woodland systems in the Ozarks. The showy Ozark beard tongue, those flowers can get about 3 inches long. This is the rarest of our coneflower, the yellow coneflower or Bush's coneflower, Echinacea paradoxa, only found in dolomite glades. A rare poppy mallow, that's Caleroy bushii or Bush's poppy mallow. And this is a restored glade landscape. So this is in Missouri, where they've done a lot of restoration. They have more dolomite glades than we do, but this was full of cedar in the openings that you see in the background and the foreground. And then the cedar were mostly stripped away and the older oak trees were left. So there were trees in these landscapes, but they were kind of in deeper soil pockets or down in the hollows below a low bluff line. There's probably a little bluff line separating what you're seeing in the middle, these trees down here with this higher, thinner soil. There's a real mosaic, but a lot of open grassland. You can see they didn't quite take all the cedars out, but it took most of them out, and it would have been wall-to-wall cedar in there. It's pretty amazing that these can recover as much as they can, and they won't all respond the same way, but if you have a site that hasn't been grazed too much in the past and still has some of the native flora, you can cut the cedar out. It's very laborious, remove it, reintroduce fire, and get a pretty spectacular restoration, and we're trying to do that wherever we can. There it is on a big scale, and you can see, I talked to the ecologist that was responsible for this particular restoration. He said they have the forest is on the Mark Twain National Forest, and the Forest Service has, you know, best management practices when they remove trees, and we do here too, that you're not supposed to take trees within so many feet of a stream. And so they had to leave the cedar along the stream right here, which is too bad because there's a lot of rare species, and there were not cedar there historically, and it was open all the way across, and there's a lot of rare species of glade plants that have to be right on the little drainage, and they're still suffering in there, but well-intentioned, but it kind of made a mess of the restoration there. But still awesome. You can see the barren landscape there and all the flowers in the foreground. That's that rare echinacea in the foreground. Saline Barrens, same thing. Critical habitat for some rare birds like this Henslow sparrow that winter in these shortgrass barrens. The Saline Barrens. It's the habitat for the geocarpon minimum, federally listed endangered. And around those barrens, there's these extensive flatwoods, and flatwoods are, you know, old river terraces that it's a wetland part of the year and it's really dry part of the year. But all the water comes from precipitation. I talked about this in ecoregion talk as well, but it would rain in the wet season and there's a clay layer under the soil that keeps it kind of open, and that water just sits on it. But then by the summer, because all the water is from precipitation, it's a dry season, you lack that vegetation. And there's a really rare, there's a number of rare species of animals associated with these, but a really rare bird that's on the federal endangered species list is the red-cockaded woodpecker, which needs open pine savanna, and it nests in live old pine trees. So it's in pretty bad shape because there's not a lot of either of those left. But we managed for it, and we've reintroduced it to Warren Prairie Natural Area. In South Arkansas, we now have, I think, 10 or 12 breeding pairs down there. It's really making a comeback. And we also have a Pine City Natural Area where this photo is. And these, as I mentioned, these are kind of wet half the year, but dry half the year. And the soil is what we call hydroxeric. It's wet dry as a seasonal cycle. And during the dry season, it's a very fire-prone system. So historically, these were open savannas. Were really kind of like what you see here. There's a restored example. You can see all the flora on the ground. You see all biologists oohing and ahhing at it. And there's a lot of cool plants, a lot of wetland plants and a lot of dry plants. You'll find that eastern agave growing right next to a wetland sedge in some of these flatwoods. It's pretty impressive. And embedded within these big river terrace pine savannas are a number of rare patch communities or small isolated communities that have a lot of interesting plants in them. Things like these herbaceous seepage bogs. These are like fire maintained in an open state, but they're groundwater fed wetlands. And they're open enough that they have all these rare orchids and things in them, but they still support, of course, actually a pretty high diversity of trees and shrubs. And that's where we find some of these rare orchids, like I talked about, the crested fringe, or the yellow fringe, the crested fringe. This is a really rare orchid in Arkansas on the lower left. That's the snake mouth or rose begonia. Just a couple of sites anymore for that in Arkansas. And these seepage bogs and pine savannas are sort of the northern analog to the longleaf pine pitcher plant bogs of the outer Gulf coastal plain. We actually have a number of the plants that are common down in, say, coastal Alabama, Florida, in those longleaf savannas. We have a fair number of those plants that are very rare up here in our best pine savannas. We don't have any pitcher plants that we found yet, but there's one species that comes way up to North Louisiana, and I suspect we either have it somewhere or we used to have it. But this photo I took in coastal Alabama. And then even in the mountains, we have flatwoods, and these are really a rare type. Historically would have been pretty open, fire maintained. You can have basically a swamp on a mountaintop up in the post oak shortleaf pine mountains, a depression flat or a wet flat. It gets all that water from rain and has this open condition because of periodic fire, and a lot of rare wet grassland plants. There's some spiderworts and a really nice purple milkweed. That's a site in Missouri. I talked about the sand barrens a little bit already. And then I mentioned I was going to talk about river scour. So these river scour barrens are really fascinating, and they have some of the rarest plants of any habitat in Arkansas. And again, like the shale barrens and some of the other glades, there are apparently several species new to science that are undescribed, that are being worked on, that occur. And this is fascinating, not just in our river scour, but other river scour systems across the southeast, like on the Cumberland Plateau of Tennessee and Kentucky and Alabama, or over in Oklahoma, or up on the, all these places, like it occurs up in Virginia and Pennsylvania, this habitat. And some of these new species apparently are in all of these sites, wide disjunctions, but appear to be the same thing. There's a really fascinating shared history behind these or something. And this is what they look like on the ground. These are some of the biggest river scour barrens we have in Arkansas on the Cossatop River. And basically, they occur where there's pretty stable, large substrates like boulders, and I mean big boulders, or large cobble, 50-pound rocks, stuff like that, or bedrock. And here you can see bedrock and boulders and cobbles, all three. But there's not a lot of small gravel or sand or anything. You have pockets of it in between that stuff. But these rivers flood so violently that they literally scour away the woody vegetation. Giant boulders and cobbles go rolling down these flood events and just break the trees off, smash them out, keep them open. And then it leaves this real thin soil areas, so they're really, really dry in the summer. And you'll have prickly pear cactus and yucca and all that growing right here, even though it's right on the river. And the river channel is off to the left side of the background at the base of that hill. And this is an elevated sort of terrace that gets scoured, and it has some of the rarest plants in the whole continent. This is a really rare grass called Cumberland sandreed. It's mostly over in the Cumberland Plateau of Tennessee over there in the same habitat. And we get it over here on some of our best river scour. And then on the larger rivers, there were these deep sand grasslands. And again, these are pretty hard to come by. This one's still intact example on the Red River in extreme southwest Arkansas, Miller County. And you can see these are sand dunes. This is like what you would expect to see on the coast, on the beaches. It's basically the same sort of a habitat. You have these rolling dunes You have little wetlands in between them sometimes. Very sparse vegetation. You see these clump grasses and some really rare plants and really rare animals associated with these. This is an interior least tern. It's an endangered species of bird that nests on these bare sand areas, especially on islands where predators can't get to it so much. There's a bunch of really rare tiger beetles that live in the sand dunes on these grasslands, and a bunch of rare plants like this convolvulus. I forget the common name of it, but it's a rare one. And we had these all up and down the Arkansas River, the White, the Red, the Mississippi. A lot of them are gone today. This is a cool, I think I probably showed this last time, but this is a cool picture. It was taken either around the late 1800s, turn of the century, looking upstream in Little Rock from downtown. It's actually pretty sure it was taken on a smokestack behind the old Little Rock Trolley Company maintenance barn. And just so happens that the new Natural Heritage Commission office is on that site, and the foundation of that old smokestack is still on the edge of our parking lot. And they had a bucket lift out there to change the light bulbs in the parking lot. And I said, hey, run me up on top about 60 feet up, where above the foundation of that old smokestack. I want to try to take a picture of the same view. And it worked out. So this is the Bering Cross Train Bridge 120 years ago. And this is the same view today. So the thing to see is the amount of space between the bridge. The bridge is in the same height. This has been replaced, but that gap between the water and the bottom of the bridge today is a lot less. And it stays pretty high because it's just basically a lake now. There's a series of 13 locks and dams on the river in Arkansas. In the background, you can still see the bluffs and the landscape in the background, but there's a giant sandbar in the old days. And today, those are all gone. That's they dredge that out, and they keep the water high, and they keep it all channelized. It never floods. So we've lost all that habitat. We also have these marshes. There's several types of marshes. These are big river backwater marshes. This is near the Arkansas River at Goose Pond Natural Area, an old abandoned channel scar, really rich marsh communities. We also have in the coastal plain, especially along these spring-fed stream systems, these massive beaver marsh complexes. And this is a really fascinating community. There's a lot of rare plants associated with it. It's what we call a floatant marsh, and it's literally a floating mat of grassland that occurs in these ancient, or at least mature, long-term beaver ponds that have been impounded for really long periods. And this community is built up of all these plants that are interlaced together and float on the water. You can walk out on that and it quakes underneath you like you're walking on a waterbed. And it has all these really cool rare plants. A little bit more on glades. We've done a lot of work trying to map these, as I mentioned. Part of that was before we had the glade map, we would go out in a plane or a helicopter and try to ground truth these. So I would go in the wintertime and map them on the computer on aerial photography like this, and then go out. We partnered with the helicopter or with the Forest Service to use their helicopters on national forests, and we would fly like that's the same site from the air. And a lot of times, it's tricky. You're looking at an aerial photograph and you think it's a glade, but it's an old pasture with cedar trees in it or something. But this allowed us to go, in 2 or 3 days and do several months worth of field checks to just see if they're really glades or if there's some false positive. Because you can fly over 40 of these in a flight, 50 of them, and check them out. It's been real effective use of time. And we've found some wonderful sites and a lot of turned out rare plant records after we hiked in. It is now 11:15. Do you want to take another 5-minute break?
It wouldn't let me unmute myself. Yes, that would be good. One quick question, I guess, does ANHC use drone footage on its own to help generate GIS data? Or?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that. Yeah, I don't think I have any examples in here. I should have put one in. We have a couple of drones, and it's been awesome. We've been able to map rare plant populations even. Like there's this rare shrub called corkwood and we found it out in this kind of shrub marsh area over in our Benson Creek Natural Area. It was real hard to get around in there and count how many we had or how big the population was. So we flew a drone up over it, and you can geo-reference the drone imagery that you take and bring it into the GIS, and it lines up exactly. We were able to do that and just click around. You could see the whole population of these things, and you could count the stems, and we were able to see how many acres it occupied and all this stuff from the drone footage. It was pretty spectacular.
Wow.
So yes, we're using that.
Anybody have questions right now? If not, it's 11:15. Let's be back at 11:20. Is that okay?
Great.
All right.
Yep.
Thank you. Lily still out? Oh, great. I have ants coming in the windowsill. Good.
Or not good.
Yeah. Yeah. I've got 11:20. Is that what we said?
Yeah,
Okay.
let's go. All right. So I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit because of the time. I want to make sure to cover a couple other things, like getting into some of the invasives and other things. There are different kinds of threats. You can talk about the different ones. I talked about threats into habitats earlier, some other general threats to biodiversity, but specifically about plants, we can kind of drill down a little further into 5 major ones. There's habitat destruction, over-collecting or poaching, diseases and pathogens, exotic invasives, and then again, the changes in ecosystem processes, which I talked about. And that habitat destruction is pretty self-explanatory, but sometimes it's subtle. This is a prairie remnant called Chesney Prairie Natural Area. It's in northwest Arkansas. And again, this is a winter image of taken probably in January or early February. And this whole area was historically a prairie and savanna. And that entire ecosystem in this part of the world is a warm season vegetation, has warm season vegetation, meaning that it's completely dormant in the winter. And that was, again, the time when Native Americans would burn this system off. And so what you're seeing here with all the red and pink is a photo showing that all of that is green in the winter. That's all fescue grass, non-native grass brought in for winter pasture. And basically it's showing that the native ecosystem with its hundreds and hundreds of species has been replaced by a monoculture of this fescue. Excuse me. Except in the middle is the prairie, and it's a warm season system. But you can see within that there are areas of red and pink, and those are invasive species from the surrounding landscape that have worked their way into the lower, wetter areas of the prairie. And it's the fescue grass and 3 or 4 other things. So sometimes it's pretty subtle, but this bird's eye view with this infrared imagery can really sort of show the extent of some of the damage. And a lot of times these remnant natural areas are just such tiny postage stamp scraps. Like this is Searles Prairie Natural Area. It's the only surviving remnant of what was about a 20,000 acre prairie, and it's 10 acres. And it's surrounded on all sides by development. There's a golf course on one side, there's a nursing home, there's a highway, there's a residential development. And, they become a management challenge because you have all this alteration around it and this constant source of, say, non-native plants, or hydrology has been screwed up by the road. There's also always these challenges to these, but at the same time, they're such critical sites. That's the only site in the state for a couple of plants. There's no other place in Arkansas where they're left that we know of, except for this one little scrap of prairie in the middle of Rogers. So, we have to figure out a way to manage these. And actually, Master Naturalists do a lot of management for us at that site. So thank you all. Over-collecting is a major factor for certain species or kinds of species. Ginseng is a good example. Some of you may have seen this unfortunate show called Appalachian Outlaws or something like that on the TV about these guys that go out and dig up the ginseng and fight each other or whatever that happens. And I mean, it's worth a lot of money. So dried ginseng root has gone as high as $1,000 a pound. So persecution on these plants is pretty significant. And it's rare to find them at all anymore, and really rare to find big old plants like this 5-prong plant. Certain things, the coneflowers get it pretty hard for the medicinal trade. The orchids get dug up for people trying to grow them. This is one of our rarest orchids in the state, the Queen Lady Slipper or Pink Lady Slipper. Today it's known from just a couple of sites in very rugged terrain on steepy cliff faces over in the eastern part of the Ozarks. There were other sites known historically. For example, there was Carl Hunter, who wrote the Wildflowers of Arkansas book, has passed away now, but he told me one time that his mentor, Dwight Moore, who was a professor at U of A back in the middle 1900s, knew of 5 sites for this in Benton County, but they were all gone because they've been dug out. And we don't have any records anywhere near Benton County today. Just these few sites over in the eastern Ozarks on the bluff faces. This is a habitat where it's found today. I'm standing there, and 16 feet above the ground, there's a little ledge right here. And that ledge has a groundwater seep coming out on top of it. And these plants right up there are these orchids. And that was about a 4-hour hike to get down in there. There's the orchids growing on that soupy ledge. This is the only kind of places they're left because people couldn't get them. Some plants are affected by diseases and pathogens. One you may be familiar with already is the Ozark chinkapin. This is one of 2 native chestnuts that we have in Arkansas. And at one time, it was a very common species in acidic upland woodlands and forests across the Ozarks and Ouachitas. And it was a big canopy tree. There's records from the 1880s of trees 4 feet in diameter and 100 feet tall. And today, if you find it at all, it's a tiny little bush. And the reason being, when it gets a certain size to where the bark starts to develop cracks and fissures, as they do when they get big like an oak tree, a fungus that was accidentally introduced from Asia called the chestnut blight jumps into them and kills them to the ground. And they'll resprout for a period of time. We don't know how long that can keep happening. But it's very rare that they ever even flower, and very, very rare that they ever make seed today. There is a neat project going on by an organization called the Ozark Chinkapin Foundation that's working to reintroduce or to find the most blight-resistant individual trees and crossbreed them. And there's volunteers working on this project across the landscape. And they're beginning to see some progress. So they may be able to breed somewhat at least blight-resistant chinkapin and get it back into the canopy. Another example is our white walnut or butternut. Everyone's familiar with the black walnut. This is the rare cousin of it, Juglans cinerea. And it has instead of a round fruit, it has like a football-shaped fruit, really hairy plant, quite different, and supposedly very good to eat, although I've never found one with a fruit big enough to eat. I couldn't tell you myself, but there's a disease called the butternut canker. That's all these things are fungal pathogens from another part of the world that were brought over on ornamental plants or lumber or some other import by accident that are now wreaking havoc on our native flora here. And this thing, some people say it'll probably go extinct. Other people are more optimistic. I don't know what to think really, but it is very rare to find a uninfected, healthy butternut anymore. And if you do know of any, we would love to know where they are at the Heritage Program because we track it as a rare species. Then there's the pervasive and ever-present problem with exotic invasives. And of course, this is kudzu, which is kind of the poster child. There are sites, this was taken, I think, in Mississippi, but there's a lot of this in eastern Arkansas and Crowley's Ridge. If you go down near Helena, you can see 100-acre patches of kudzu where there are no other plants left. It's completely overtaken the entire forest. All the other plants are gone. And this is what you see, just this sort of wasted, unusable landscape of very low biodiversity. We have a lot of invasive plants. They all share one or more of these characteristics. It kind of makes them invasive. A lot of them make abundant seeds or other propagules. Sometimes it's like a little tuber on the vine that would drop off and root, or they break apart like a water hyacinth and just re-root from a fragment. They have high germination rates a lot of times. Some of them spread vegetatively by rhizomes or runners as well as by seed. Their dispersal of their seeds or other propagules is very effective. Things like water birds or the wildlife, a lot of them make a fruit that's tasty to the birds and they spread it all over the world. And a lot of them lack predators or pathogens or whatever that sort of, or the competition that was inherent in their native landscape that's not here from other plants. So there's things like that. Just give you a quick rundown of some nasties that you probably know. Chinese privet's one of the worst ones in central Arkansas. It's a semi-evergreen. This is showing in the dead of winter, and you can still sort of see that it has a lot of leaves on it. Further south, it's almost a true evergreen. Not quite, but it will make impenetrable thickets rapidly. The birds love it. They spread it all over from seed. And it especially likes riparian areas along creeks or moisture areas. And I've seen where, you know, it's become the 100% cover in the understory, shading out the ground cover. And then say a landowner comes and removes the canopy trees, like logs it, and it never even comes back to trees. This is in the stable state privet thicket now. I mean, that's the canopy now, even 15 years after the logging job, because no trees can come up through it. So pretty major impact. There it is. This is in a park here in Little Rock. You can see Japanese honeysuckle is on the left side of the photo and privet on the right and in the background. Tree of Heaven is another big one. This is an urban park here in Little Rock, and it's not the greatest quality photo, but what you're seeing there's a power line cut in the foreground. And in that power line opening, there are thousands of stems of Tree of Heaven. It's just full. And this used to be an urban tree that you would find in urban areas, but now it is in the most remote parts of like the Upper Buffalo Wilderness area, or most rugged remote areas where you'll see a natural tree fall, like a light gap in the canopy where a big old tree is blown down. And this will be all filling in the gap. And it's going to replace the trees, even in these remote sites, with these trees of heaven. Or tree from hell, as some ecologists like to call it. Spotted knapweed is an interesting one. This is spreading across North Arkansas. It's now in the Washington as well. It's becoming the dominant on high pH roadsides, for example. It makes use of a kind of a chemical warfare technique where it's called allelopathy, and the plant actually produces chemicals that it puts into the soil where it grows that inhibit the germination of all other species except itself. And it is becoming major dominant across parts of North Arkansas. It also has some very powerful chemistry, maybe the same compounds, I don't know, but there's been well-documented occurrences of volunteers who do in management or hand pulling these in other parts of the country who've developed tumors in their hands and wrists from handling the plant without gloves. And so there's kind of a strict protocol now to use gloves if you're hand pulling this, and pretty serious stuff. This is air potato. This is one that has an interesting reproductive strategy as well as flowers and seeds. It makes these little tiny potato-looking tubers on the vine that break off and can start a new plant. It's a relative of wild yam, or it is relatively yams. You might recognize the leaves. This is not winter creeper, but similar. It's periwinkle is a evergreen ground cover, or nearly it's evergreen. And here it is in a park in Little Rock where it's been planted along, it houses along the upper part of the ridge and is covering acres and acres of these hillsides. It only stops there where it does because there's a mountain bike trail, and it's kept it from creeping across the trail there. But imagine if you're a plant that needs that early spring light, where you're dependent on getting light before the trees leaf out, and now you've got this blanket of 2-foot deep periwinkle all over the mountainside. You're just gonna be out of luck. Japanese honeysuckle, another big one, everywhere. And it, people are surprised to learn that it's not native. Oh, I thought that was native. I saw that all my life. Yeah, exactly. And it's everywhere, and it runs along the ground. It makes these runners that just spread all out and rapidly cover the ground, and then of course it grows up and outcompetes everything else. A few years ago, there was a survey that went around to ecologists across the East from NatureServe, and they wanted to know what are the worst invasives that you're the most concerned about. And I believe this was the number one choice in the survey. This is a little grass called Japanese stilt grass, Microstegium vominium, and it's almost like magic how fast it spreads. This will get into a watershed and be spread along a stream terrace or floodplain, and in just like a couple of years, it's everywhere, the whole landscape on these floodplains is full of it. And it can grow in any kind of shaded, what we call mesic or sort of moderately moist shaded habitat. And it makes a blanket over the whole ground. It looks like a tiny bamboo, but it's not woody, but the leaves are real similar. And it'll just sprawl over everything. And I don't know if it does an allelopathic chemical thing like the knapweed or not, but it will outcompete everything. And you'll have floodplains that look like this. It used to have trillium and phlox and trout lilies and all that stuff. And then here's what you end up with. And then all sorts of ornamental plants that were brought over that the birds spread, and it's just everywhere. Bush honeysuckle, oriental bittersweet, silk tree or mimosa, empress tree, English ivy, red-tip photinia, sweet breath of spring honeysuckle, Chinese holly. All of these are just increasingly common, and we're finding them. Used to be in urban areas, and now we're finding them just everywhere in a generation. In our grasslands, we have some real nasties. There's Johnson grass, which is a really aggressive warm season grass. It likes fire, and it will absolutely take over. We spend a lot of effort trying to eradicate this. Some of the Lespedizas, this is a bicolor Lespediza, which is a large, almost shrubby-like Lespediza. We have a lot of great native Lespedizas, but for some reason, they were not considered good enough for the wildlife, and the game agencies used to plant all these other nasty ones from Asia, two in particular, these two, the big one bicolor on the left, and Cuniato or Ceresia Lespediza on the right, which is more common in Arkansas, but they're both highly invasive in open grasslands.
Do you have time for three quick questions? Sorry.
Yeah, good.
There's the Japanese one that you were talking about, the name I've already forgotten, you said was like the #1 choice for invasives. Does it have yellow flowers?
No,
Okay.
it's a true grass. So, it has a flower, but you wouldn't notice it. It's just a little, stamens hanging out, white. It's not showy. Doesn't have a flower like a broadleaf plant would.
What about is leatherleaf mahonia an invasive species?
Sort of, maybe. It's not super aggressive, but we're finding it out in wild sites, especially mostly in urban areas. But it's in these parks around Little Rock. But it's never filling the whole understory. It's scattered around. I'd say it's moderately invasive, but so far not a major concern. Okay.
And one other one, you may be going to say something about this, but are there any initiatives to encourage cities or other managers to eradicate invasives, other plant managers?
Yeah, there's a lot of, any kind of conservation agency that's, Game and Fish or Natural Heritage or Nature Conservancy that has property is already hopefully doing something, certainly within our mandate. Municipalities, we're sort of behind the curve, of course, in Arkansas, especially with any regulation. Fayetteville has this invasive species ordinance and are actually controlling it in their parks. The Master Naturalists are doing some of that work, in fact. We don't have anything like that around here, with any teeth in it, no. In Central Arkansas that I know of. Maybe I'm wrong, but I haven't heard.
Okay, thanks.
That's it?
That's it.
Okay. A couple other ones from the ornamental trade. The wisterias, there's a couple of them. There's Japanese and Chinese, Wisteria floribunda and sinense, that you see, you never really notice them except in the early spring when they flower, and then you're like, wow, this is giant, covering 5 acres. And that's an old plant from a house. It just kept growing and sprawled across the ground and grew up over the trees, almost like kudzu. We have some nasty aquatic invasives. This is taken in Little Rock. This is in Fush Bottoms, which is the big city-owned forested wetland complex. Well, mostly forested. This is open marsh, but this is right off of 65th Street or somewhere over here, I-30. Big open marsh, could have 80 species of native wetland plants, but instead it has one giant stand of alligator weed, which is a really nasty invasive from South America that has taken over all kinds of marshes. It's just 100% cover. That's many acres. And this is another one that grows with it a lot. This is the Asian spiderwort, Mardania Casac, that grows along wetland fringes and shallow water marshes and stream banks. Seeps any kind of long duration wetland that's open. And then a really scary one that we have so far, we're at kind of the last frontier against this in the region, because it mostly started on the coast and has been working its way inland, is giant reed or common reed, Phragmites australis. It's a large grass. It can get 16 feet tall or so. And in a square meter, you can have, no, in a square foot, I think they've documented 100 stems. Density, it's so dense you can't get through it. It's almost like a bamboo type. I mean, it's not a bamboo, but it's a big, thick stem, as big around as your thumb, 16 feet tall. And we found that now at about 5 sites in Arkansas. The largest populations down here in Little Rock on Fish. You can see it off the I-30 highway between Granite Mountain and I-30 in the wintertime. You can look up into those marshes. There's about 30 acres of it down there. Water hyacinth is one that we did get the plant board to pass legislation on. It's illegal to sell it anymore. Maybe to possess it, I can't remember, but it's one we tried to sort of nip in the bud, but I think it's like all of these, you almost can't win. I mean, you can manage it in a site, try to keep it out, but there's a lot more of these plants than there are people controlling them, and it's an exponential increase a lot of times if you look at the spread of these things. And this one, it doesn't take much. A tiny fragment. It can, I think, also do it by seed, and it makes these giant floating mats. It's a really cool plant, but wow, it's invasive. And then there's a bunch of submerged aquatics that are bad. This is hydrilla, which is now throughout the Ouachita system, the Arkansas system, and it will completely fill in the underwater portions of these open wetlands. And it's completely unknown to science how it gets spread. Nobody can figure it out. Of course, a joke. Just takes a tiny fragment on a boat motor, take it to another waterway, and it'll infest the whole thing. This is it in Lake Ouachita. All of that sort of brownish stuff in the shallow water of this cove is that species, and actually mixed in with a couple other aquatic invasives, but mostly it's hydrilla. And when they found it, it was in the lake back in the early 2000s. They said, oh, well, we'll do a drawdown, and they'll draw the water down a little bit and dry it out and kill it. And they found out it was rooted like 20 feet deep, and it was unsuccessful. And I think the latest attempt, I think it was 5,000 acres of the lake was infested with it at that time. And then they introduced a non-native insect from its native range that preys on it, called the Pakistani fly. It's an aquatic larva that gets down there and eats the plant or damages it in some way. I don't know that that's been effective either. And of course, you start bringing in more stuff from somewhere else, you never know what'll happen. This is it again. This one is found also in the Ouachita system now. This river's in Florida, but you know, this is what it can do here. So that whole riverway is choked with this Eurasian milfoil, and you can see where a boat has gone through it and sort of left a trail. And then there's a bunch of other ones. It's just kind of a sad part of the talk. I'm going to get too into it. Purple loosestrife is one that's just showing up in Arkansas. It'll fill an entire wetland in short order. Beautiful plant. We have worked with the plant board to control it everywhere it's been found so far. I think it was found in 3 or 4 places. But if you see this one, let us know quick. And then another nasty one in the mesic woods, in the stream terraces and stuff, is garlic mustard. It's a species of mustard that crush the leaves. They smell like garlic. And it, like the Japanese stiltgrass, will completely fill the understory and outcompete everything. And then there's some more of these shrubs that the birds have spread around. This is autumn olive. It was brought as an ornamental hedgerow thing, but it was also brought by the wildlife agencies as, you know, something to save the wildlife and feed them, as if they couldn't survive without our help. But it's now spreading all over the place, and you see it along streams and places like that. And then in our dry grasslands, we've got some pretty nasty European grasses, some of the brome or cheat grasses that not only fill in these glades and outcompete things, but they change the fire behavior. It becomes a very very hot fire if fire gets in there. They spread along roadsides and get in glades. Some of these plants alter the ecosystem processes as well as just directly compete. And then there's some invasive animals that are really wreaking havoc on some of our rare habitats or native plants. This was a beautiful glade a few years ago up near Calico Rock on the Sillamore district of the Ozark National Forest. And what you see there now, it looks like someone has taken a tiller in there and tilled up the whole glade, but actually those are wild hogs that did that. So the feral hogs, which are not native here, are rapidly, exponentially increasing across the state. And they used to be a problem down primarily in wetlands and swamps and river bottoms. And now they're on these mountaintops wrecking these glades. They just love the glades. They're rooting, we think, for tuberous plants, wild onions and camassia and other things that have a bulb on them, as well as insects and roots in the soil, but they're destroying the glades. And then invasive species of plants come in with a disturbance, and the glades probably never recover. And then, of course, fire suppression we talked about, cedar encroaching into the glades we've talked about, starts out innocent enough and becomes 100% shade. And we go in and laboriously, with chainsaw crews, go in and cut these up, pile them and burn them, clear them out to restore these sites. And then we reintroduce fire in our prairies, of course, to keep them healthy. And even times, I've been doing this for 20 years, but after the burn, I still sometimes look out there and think, God, what have we done? We've wrecked this place. But you just wait a couple weeks and it just greens up so lush and all these flowers come up. And we really are doing good things out there to these. This was a cedar encroached blackland prairie in Savannah that we took the cedar out of and burned. All these plants came up. We didn't plant any of them. They were all there in seeds. Talked about flooding. Sorry for the repeat slides. There were several talks combined here. This wanted to just give some examples of native species and communities here close to Central Arkansas, in Central Arkansas. This was a big county level study of the flora I did in Saline County from 2002 to 2007. And I just got into a lot of neat habitats, discovered over 1,600 different species of plants in that one county, or documented them. And it's a good place to illustrate some of these things. So there's where I'm talking about. And, we talked about ecoregions. So Saline, Pulaski, Hot Spring, Clark, all these counties in here are sort of shared between the Gulf Coastal Plain and the Ouachita Mountains. So they have two big natural divisions or ecoregions in there, and even more of these level 4, the finer ecoregions we talked about. So pretty broad habitat diversity. Like in Saline County, there's the Fush Mountains, part of the Ouachitas, the really rugged sandstone ridges, the Central Hills ridges and valleys, a lot of shale valleys and low ridges, and a little bit of the Central Mountain Ranges, which is the high novaculite, rugged part of the Central Ouachitas. We got the tertiary uplands of the coastal plain, the floodplains and low terraces, and then the Saline River bottoms. Oh, that's the floodplains and low terraces. The Pleistocene fluvial terraces were the ancient high terraces of the Saline River, where the pine savannas were. So there's different types of forests in Central Arkansas. We can just sort of extrapolate out. We've got different kinds of flatwoods, bottomland hardwood forests along the major streams, mesic hardwood forests on the north slopes, riverine forests along the river banks, pine plantations, of course, everywhere, upland pine hardwood forests, and little riparian forests throughout small streams. Bottomland hardwood forest gets its water from rain, of course, but also largely from flooding of the rivers. So these are the wettest forests along the rivers, and the lowest terrain that floods periodically and inundates the soil for long periods. And we get some really cool rare plants in that. There's a beautiful orchid in Central Arkansas. It's in wet hardwood flatwoods and bottomland forests called the purple fringeless orchid, very rare for us. This was taken along the Saline River, Saline County. And then those higher terraces, again, we get that open pine savanna woodland community where it used to be real open, prairie-like understory, lots of fire, big widely spaced trees. rare today, and that's where it was in Saline County on those high terraces. Lots of rare plants associated with that ecosystem, things like the slender marsh pink, very rare in Arkansas. I mentioned the hardhack spirea that was found over in the Grand Prairie. That specimen from the 1800s. Well, it still occurs down in southern Saline County and southern Pulaski County on these high terraces in mostly power line rights of way or roadsides where it's still open. There's some wonderful carnivorous plants in these pine savannas and prairies both. This is a sundew. It traps insects in these sticky hairs and digests them. And it does that to make up nutrition for its poor acidic soils, low nutrients where it grows. I've talked about mesic hardwood forests. These are those natural closed canopy systems with shade-tolerant flora, rich in the springtime. Talked about the dry, rocky uplands, mesic forest. This is some interesting plants that you can find in these mesic stream terraces. This is a wonderful plant. Gets about 6 feet tall, maybe 7. It's called the American Columbo, Swertia caroliniensis. And you'll have these colonies of this thing where there's these giant rosettes of leaves on the ground, and they rarely flower. So you'll find a whole colony of these big strap-like leaves that are, the clump of leaves is 2.5 feet across. And then you'll just find a few that flower in a year, and they're pretty spectacular. It's one to look for. It's not common, but you can find it around. The mesic forests have a number of wonderful sort of Appalachian-type shrubs like this Carolina silver bell, and there's some green violets, and a lot of wonderful mesic plants. There's some rare endemic plants that occur in these mesic forests as well. It's not all in the grasslands. This is Brown's waterleaf, found only in Arkansas. All the known sites, they're mapped on the by those stars there. And it's an interesting story. It was first collected in 1835 by a botanist named George Engelman, who came in from Missouri. He was a doctor in Missouri. He came to Hot Springs from Little Rock in 1835. And he collected this on the North Fork of the Saline River, but he only grabbed the above ground portion of the plant. And it looks very similar to a common species east of the Mississippi River, another species of waterleaf, and that's what it was identified as. Years later, in 1992, a botanist was doing a study for the Ouachita National Forest of rare plants, and found this and dug a proper specimen with the below ground parts, and it has these great big tubers on it, just totally unlike any other species in the genus, including the one east of the river that looks similar. And they started looking into it even more carefully and found some real differences in the above ground part of the plant too. It's a totally distinct species. It was described new to science in the 90s. Brown's waterleaf, only found in the Ouachita Mountain of Arkansas. Another really rare one that's in central Arkansas, and this has been found since in Pulaski County. It's known from Fush Creek Bottoms and Kleinman Park here in Little Rock. This is the Arkansas meadow rue, globally rare. Beautiful little plant related to the tall meadow rue, but also the common rue anemone is in the same genus. But it's a really neat little delicate spring ephemeral. It's very narrow range. Along our riparian streams, we get unique communities where the water, there's just higher moisture in the soil from the stream channel. There's just more water availability, and you get a different flora than you do in the surrounding uplands. I talked about glades and woodlands, just the local flavor here. In Saline County, there are shale barrens, the igneous nepheline cyanite glades, the sandstone glades, and the vaculite or chert glades in the sandhill woodland. Again, this is Middle Fork Barrens, where we have the rarest of the rare glade types, a seasonally wet, mucky soil, thin over bedrock, with all these globally rare plants in this little spring-fed valley. And that is about as rare a glade type as we have in Eastern North America. And there are many, many rare species there. That's a lot of delphinium or Carolina larkspur, wild onions, the neem stylus, the Neville's pleat leaf. The drier rocky barrens, you get our native verbena or rose verbena, and just this incredible grassland flora. It's all the same site at Middle Fork Barrens. There's a compass plant, sunflower relative. A lot of dry glade habitats. Buckbrush. Some very rare endemic corn salads found only in the Ouachitas. There's a little Valerianella palmeri, the Palmer's corn salad, G3. Ouachita Blue Star, also G3. Wonderful garden plant. This is available in the commercial trade now, but in the wild it's quite rare. A rare grassland trout lily, one of the white ones, prairie trout lily. Pelton's rose gentian. A couple of glades of nepheline syenite in southern Saline County and Middle Fort Barrens natural area. Only sites in the world. Except one time it was found on Halloween. It was found in central Arkansas. One year back in 2005 or 6, right here, there it is. This is my daughter Analia dressed as Pelton's rose gentian for Halloween in 2006.
So
yeah. This was the year it was described. So see that she was almost 2, I guess, in 2005. Yeah, there's the Nuttall's pleatleaf at Middle Fort Barrens, largest population in the world. These open for about an hour and a half in the late evening, right before sunset. And they're pollinated by these little syrphid flies that come out. Just a few other examples of some of these rare Barrens plants. There's another endemic corn salad. It's actually a G2 now. It's even rarer than the Palmers. This is the Nuttall's corn salad. Endemic again to Arkansas and Oklahoma. And the small-headed pipewort I mentioned earlier that only grows in little spring-fed seeps in the open glade that stay wet into the summer. Talked about the open ground whittlowwort earlier, a little rare mustard. The nepheline syenite glades, extremely rare. Sandstone barrens, these are all repeat slides, I apologize. But that's, a couple more to talk about. This is the Arkansas twist flower. So this is an interesting one. Another one of our Arkansas endemics. Very strong Pulaski County connection on this one. This was first observed, or first written about anyway, by Thomas Nuttall 200 years ago last year when he came up the Arkansas River, first trained naturalist to explore the region, and he observed it in the Folk Mountains, which is essentially Pinnacle Mountain State Park. Probably he was actually on the north side of the river on this isolated hill over there called Rector Hill. And he went up that and described a plant in March that looked like a mustard greens. He said it looked like it looks like the one from Europe, but it's without question indigenous. And he definitely saw this plant. That's exactly what it looks like that time of the year. And it still grows on that hill, but it's only known from a portion of the Arkansas portion of the Ouachita Mountains, and is quite rare. A number of kinds of wetlands in central Arkansas. I think, well, I'll tell you what, I'll just quit right here because we only have a couple minutes. And if you have any questions, we can go over this. It's just too much to cover in 3 hours.
But you do it well. You really do.
I give it a shot every time. I think I've ever made it all the way.
Hey, one quick question was, what was the purple one that bloomed at sunset only, and can we plant it here? I'm sorry, I lost it.
That was the Nuttall's pleatleaf.
Oh, okay.
Right here. I've never seen it for sale. You can certainly grow it. I mean, I've grown it from seed before. It's not hard to grow. I won't say anything if someone takes a few seeds and dig them up. Yeah, you can grow it. It needs it's not hard to grow. Open conditions, sun,
Okay.
not too dry.
Good to know.
But you'd have to grow it from seed because it's not available anywhere.
Okay.
That flower is about as big as a little bigger than a quarter across the whole flower.
It's beautiful. Yeah.
It is. It's a really neat one. And it opens up rapidly. Like it opens over the span of a few minutes. You can actually watch it twist apart and open up if you're a little bit of patience.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions? Now is your chance.
Well, I hope we can go hiking sometime.
Hope so too. Oh, Okay, somebody question asked and answered. Is this flower similar to the moonflower? And somebody says yes. So is that
Okay.
Oh, yes, the hiking. Okay.
Oh,
okay.
yeah.
Yeah,
So, I mean, you can just keep in touch with me about, I mean, whenever they relax those things and
All right.
people feel comfortable. I mean, it's no fun in the brutal summer out in those glades, but maybe we could do it early in the day or late in the day or something.
We'll just kind of
Or wait till the
adjust.
fall. I mean, whatever.
Yeah, use our opposable thumbs and be adaptive and all of that. So, well, thank you so much, very much.
My pleasure.
Really
Thanks, everybody.
enjoyed it. It's always
Okay.
good to hear. So
Great. Thanks, everybody.
thanks. Have a good afternoon.
You too. Bye.
Thanks, Theo, so much.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Okay. In answer to questions, no, we do not have any future Zoom classes scheduled. Log your hours. We're gonna see, you know, if anybody still doesn't have 40 hours and stuff, we'll try to come up with some things. And otherwise, we're just going to figure out what comes next as we move on. Nancy, do you have anything to add to that, or?
No, I don't. Just be sure you put your hours in, because sometime this week I'm going to go through and check the hours out. I'm sorry I turned my video off. I'm the flowers talking up there. I think that's it. Now we do have a a hummingbird class or meeting scheduled for our usual monthly meeting. It's actually in place of y'all's graduation. So then in May, third Thursday in May, we will have Tana Beasley talking about hummingbirds, and she's the only certified, registered, licensed, whatever, hummingbird bander in the state of Arkansas. And she was going to be at the BioBlast, but she instead will be at our Thursday night meeting, the third Thursday evening in May. I hope you'll join us, because it's just fascinating. If you've never been to see the hummingbird banding, we will try to do maybe a field trip out there when we can. It's just, oh my goodness, your heart just flutters with the little hummingbirds, because you actually get to sometimes you get to release them if there aren't too many people there, and it's just awesome. So she's awesome, and so hope you can join us for that. And I'll try to be posting any other opportunities that happen. That's it. That's all I have, Ann.
We've got, if any of you are here now and you missed one of the Zoom classes that we did record, we now have the place for them on a CAM Google Drive. So anyway, if you want to watch one of those, send me a message, text me or email me or whatever, and I'll send you the link or whatever. I don't think they're quite where they're supposed to be on the Google Drive, but getting there. So that's all I got. So
it's a learning curve. Bye, y'all.
Y'all take care.
Bye.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ann.
Thank you, Nancy.
Send me a list and I'll send out a thingy. I need to close last week's and send it to you, so I'll get that done.
Okay.
Right now.
I'll send this right now too.
All right. Bye.
Bye.